In entering upon a college course, you are taking a step that may completely revolutionize your life. You are facing new situations vastly different from any you have previously met. They are also of great variety, such as finding a place to eat and sleep, regulating your own finances, inaugurating a new social life, forming new friendships, and developing in body and mind. The problems connected with mental development will engage your chief attention. You are now going to use your mind more actively than ever before and should survey some of the intellectual difficulties before plunging into the fight. Perhaps the first difficulty you will encounter is the substitution of the lecture for the class recitation to which you were accustomed in high school. This substitution requires that you develop a new technique of learning. For the mental process involved in an oral recitation are different from those used in listening to a lecture. The lecture system implies that the lecturer has a fund of knowledge about a certain field and has organized this knowledge in a form that is not duplicated in the literature of the subject. The manner of presentation, then, is unique and is the only means of securing the knowledge in just that form. As soon as the words have left the mouth of the lecturer, they cease to be accessible to you. Such conditions require a unique mental attitude and unique mental habits. You will be obliged, in the first place, to maintain sustained attention over long periods of time. The situation is not like that in reading, in which a temporary lapse of attention may be remedied by turning back and rereading. In listening to a lecture, you are obliged to catch the words on the fly. Accordingly, you must develop new habits of paying attention. You will also need to develop a new technique for memorizing, especially for memorizing things heard. As a partial aid in this, and also for purposes of organizing material received in lectures, you will need to develop ability to take notes. This is a process with which you have heretofore had little to do. It is a most important phase of college life, however, and will repay earnest study. Another characteristic of college study is the vast amount of reading required. Instead of using a single textbook for each course, you may use several. They may cover great historical periods and represent the ideas of many men. In view of the amount of reading assigned, you will also be obliged to learn to read faster. No longer will you have time to dawdle sleepily through the pages of easy texts. You will have to cover perhaps 50 or 100 pages of naughty reading every day. Accordingly, you must learn to handle books expeditiously and to comprehend quickly. In fact, economy must be your watchword throughout. A German lesson in high school may cover 30 or 40 lines a day, requiring an hour's preparation. A German assignment in college, however, may cover 4 or 5 or a dozen pages, requiring hard work for 2 or 3 hours. You should be warned also that college demands not only a greater quantity but also a higher quality of work. When you were a high school student, the world expected only a high school student's accomplishment of you. Now you are a college student, however, and your intellectual responsibilities have increased. The world regards you now as a person of considerable scholastic attainment and expects more of you than before. In academic terms, this means that in order to attain a grade of 95 in college, you will have to work much harder than you did for that grade in high school. For here, you have not only more difficult subjects matter, but also keener competition for the first place. In high school, you may have been the brightest student in your class. In college, however, you encounter the brightest students from many schools. If your merits are going to stand out prominently, therefore, you must work much harder. Your work from now on must be of better quality. Not the least of the perplexities of your life as a college student will arise from the fact that no daily schedule is arranged for you. The only time definitely assigned for your work is the 15 hours a week, more or less spent in the classroom. The rest of your schedule must be arranged by yourself. This is a real task and will require care and throughout if your work is to be done with greatest economy of time and effort. The brief survey completes the catalogue of problems of mental development that will vex you most in adjusting your methods of study to college conditions. In order to make this adjustment, you will be obliged to form a number of new habits. Indeed, as you become more and more expert as a student, you will see that the whole process resolves itself into one of habit formation. For while a college education has two phases, the acquisition of facts and the formation of habits. It is the latter which is the more important. Many of the facts that you learn will be forgotten, many will be outlawed by time, but the habits of study you form will be permanent positions. They will consist of such things as methods of grasping facts, methods of reasoning about facts, and of concentrating attention. In acquiring these habits, you must have some material upon which you may concentrate your attention, and it will be supplied by the subjects of the curriculum. You will be asked, for instance, to write innumerable themes in courses of English composition, not for the purpose of enriching the world's literature, nor for the delectation of your English instructor, but for the sake of helping you to form habits of forceful expression. You will be asked to enter the laboratory and perform numerous experiments, not to discover hitherto unknown facts, but to obtain practice in scientific procedure and to learn how to seek knowledge by yourself. The curriculum and the faculty are the means, but you yourself are the agent in the educational process. No matter how good the curriculum or how renowned the faculty, you cannot be educated without the most vigorous efforts on your part. Banish the thought that you are here to have knowledge pumped into you. To acquire an education, you must establish and maintain not a passive attitude, but an active attitude. When you go to the gymnasium to build up a good physique, the physical director does not tell you to hold yourself limp and passive while he pumps your arms and legs up and down. Rather, he urges you to put forth effort, to exert yourself until you are tired. Only by so doing can you develop physical power. This principle holds true of mental development. Learning is not a process of passive soaking in. It is a matter of vigorous effort. And the harder you work, the more powerful you become. In securing a college education, you are your own master. In the development of physical prowess, you are well aware of the importance of doing everything in good form. In such sports as swimming and hurdling, speed and grace depend primarily upon it. The same principle holds true in the development. Most educated people find occasion at some time or other to take notes. Although this is especially true of college students, they have little success, as any college instructor will testify. Students, as a rule, do not realize that there is any skill involved in taking notes. Not until examination time arrives and they try vainly to labor through a maze of scribbling do they realize that there must be some system in note-taking. A careful examination of note-taking shows that there are rules or principles which, when followed, have much to do with increasing ability in study. One criteria that should guide in the preparation of notes is the use to which they will be put. If this is kept in mind, many blunders will be saved. Notes may be used in three ways: as material for directing each day's study, for cramming, and for permanent professional use. Thus, a notebook may be a thing of far-reaching value. Notes you take now as a student may be valuable years hence in professional life. Recognition of this will help you in the preparation of your notes and will determine many times how they should be prepared. The chief situations in college which require note-taking are lectures, library reading, and laboratory work. Accordingly, the subject will be considered under these three heads. Lecture notes. When taking notes on a lecture, there are two extremes that present themselves: to take exceedingly full notes or to take almost no notes. One can err in either direction. True, on first thought, entire stenographic reports of lectures appear desirable, but second thought will show that they may be dispensed with, not only without loss, but with much gain. The most obvious objection is that too much time would be consumed in transcribing shorthand notes. Another is that much of the material in a lecture is undesirable for permanent possession. The instructor repeats much for the sake of emphasis. He multiplies illustrations not important in themselves, but important for the sake of stressing his point. You do not need these illustrations in written form. However, for once the point is made, you rarely need to depend upon the illustrations for its retention. A still more cogent objection is that if you occupy your attention with the task of copying the lecture verbatim, you do not have time to think, but become merely an automatic recording machine. Experienced stenographers say that they form the habit of recording, so automatically they fail utterly to comprehend the meaning of what is said. You, as a student, cannot afford to have your attention so distracted from the meaning of the lecture. Therefore, reduce your classroom writing to a minimum. Probably the chief reason why students are so eager to secure full lecture notes is that they fear to trust their memory. Such fears should be put at rest, for your mind will retain facts if you pay close attention and make logical associations during the time of impression. Keep your mind free, then, to work upon the subject matter of the lecture. Debate mentally with the speaker. Question his statements, comparing them with your own experience or with the results of your study. Ask yourself frequently, is that true? The essential thing is to maintain an attitude of mental activity and to avoid anything that will reduce this and make you passive. Do not think of yourself as a vat into which the instructor pumps knowledge. Regard yourself rather as an active force, quick to perceive and to comprehend meaning, deliberate in acceptance and firm in retention. After observing the stress laid throughout this book upon the necessity for logical associations, you will readily see that the keynote to note-taking is: let your notes represent the logical progression of thought in the lecture. Strive above all else to secure the skeleton, the framework upon which the lecture is hung. A lecture is a logical structure, and the form in which it is presented is the outline. This outline, then, is your chief concern. In the case of some lectures, it is an easy matter. The lecturer may place the outline in your hands beforehand, may present it on the blackboard, or may give it orally. Some lecturers, too, present their material in such clear-cut divisions that the outline is easily followed. Others, however, are very difficult to follow in this regard. In arranging an outline, you will find it wise to adopt some device by which the parts will stand out prominently, and the progression of thought will be indicated with proper subordination of titles. Adopt some system at the beginning of your college course and use it in all your notes. The system here given may serve as a model, using first the Roman numerals, then capitals, then Arabic numerals. Look at the above image. In concluding this discussion of lecture notes, you should be urged to make good use of your notes after they are taken. First, glance over them as soon as possible after the lecture. Inasmuch as they will then be fresh in your mind, you will be able to recall almost the entire lecture. You will also be able to supply missing parts from memory. Some students make it a rule to reduce all class notes to typewritten form soon after the lecture. This is an excellent practice, but is rather expensive in time. In addition to this after-class review, you should make a second review of your notes as the first step in the preparation of the next day's lesson. This will connect up the lessons with each other and will make the course a unified whole instead of a series of disconnected parts. Too often, a course exists in a student's mind as a series of separate discussions and he sees only the horizon of a single day. This condition might be represented by a series of disconnected links. A summary of each day's lesson, however, preceding the preparation for the next day, forges new links and welds them all together into an unbroken chain. A method that has been found helpful is to use a double-page system of note-taking, using the left-hand page for the bare outline with largest divisions and the right-hand page for the details. This device makes the notebook readily available for hasty review or for more extended study. Reading notes. The question of full or scanty notes arises in reading notes as in lecture notes. In general, your notes should represent a summary in your own words of the author's discussion, not a duplication of it. Students sometimes acquire the habit of reading single sentences at a time, then of writing them down, thinking that by making an exact copy of the book, they are playing safe. This is a pernicious practice. It spoils continuity of thought and application. Furthermore, isolated sentences mean little and fail grossly to represent the real thought of the author. A better way is to read through an entire paragraph or section, then close the book and reproduce in your own words what you have read. Next, take your summary and compare with the original text to see that you have really grasped the point. This procedure will be beneficial in several ways. It will encourage continuous concentration of attention to an entire argument. It will help you to preserve relative emphasis of parts. It will lead you to regard thought and not words. You are undoubtedly familiar with the state of mind wherein you find yourself reading merely words and not following the thought. Lastly, material studied in this way is remembered longer than material read scrappily. Such a method of reading makes not only for good memory but for good mental habits of all kinds. In all your reading, hold to the conception of yourself as a thinker, not a sponge. Remember, you do not need to accept unqualifiedly everything you read. A worthy ideal for every student to follow is expressed in the motto carved on the wall of the great reading room of the Harper Memorial Library at the University of Chicago. Read not to contradict, not to believe, but to weigh and consider. Ibsen bluntly states the same thought. Don't read to swallow, read to choose, for it is but to see what one has use for. Ask yourself, when beginning a printed discussion, what am I looking for? What is the author going to talk about? Often this will be indicated in topical headings. Keep it in the background of your mind while reading and search for the answer. Then, when you have read the necessary portion, close the book and summarize to see if the author furnished what you sought. In short, always read for a purpose. Formulate problems and seek their solutions. In this way will there be direction in your readings and your thought. This discussion of reading notes has turned into an essay on how to read, and you must be convinced by this time that there is much to learn in this respect. So much that we may profitably spend more time in discussing it. Every book you take up should be opened with some preliminary ceremony. This does not refer to the physical operation of opening a new book, but to the mental operation. In general, take the following steps. Observe the title. See exactly what field the book attempts to cover. Observe the author's name. If you are to use his book frequently, discover his position in the field. Remember, you are going to accept him as authority and you should know his status. You may be told this on the title page, or you may have to consult Who's Who or the biographical dictionary. Glance over the preface. Under some circumstances, you should read it carefully. If you are going to refer to the book very often, make friends with the author. Let him introduce himself to you. This he will do in the preface. Observe the date of publication also in order to get an idea as to the recency of the material. Glance over the table of contents. If you are very familiar with the field and the table of contents is outlined in detail, you might advantageously study it and dispense with reading the book. On the other hand, if you are going to consult the book only briefly, you might find it necessary to study the table of contents in order to see the relation of the part you read to the entire work. Use the index intelligently. It may save you much time. You will have much to do throughout your college course with the making of bibliographies, that is, with the compilation of lists of books bearing upon special topics. You may have bibliographies given you in some of your courses, or you may be asked to compile your own. Under all circumstances, prepare them with the greatest care. Be scrupulous in giving references. There is a standard form for referring to books and periodicals as follows. C.R. Henderson, Industrial Insurance, 2nd edition, Chicago, The University of Chicago Press, 1912, page 321. S.I. Curtis, The Place of Sacrifice, Biblical World, volume 21, 1902, page 248 FF. Laboratory notes. The form of laboratory notes varies with the science and is usually prescribed by the instructor. Reports of the experiment are usually written up in the order object, apparatus, method, results, conclusions. When detailed instructions are given by the instructor, follow them accurately. Pay special attention to neatness. Instructors say that the greatest fault with laboratory notebook is lack of neatness. This reacts upon the instructor, causing him much trouble in correcting the notebook. The resulting annoyance frequently prejudices him against his will, against the student. It is safe to assert that you will materially increase your chances of a good grade in a laboratory course by the preparation of a neat notebook. The keynote of the 20th century is economy, the tendency in all lines being toward the elimination of waste. College students should adopt this aim in the regulation of their study affairs, and there is much opportunity for applying it in note-taking. So far, the discussion has had to do with the content of the notebook, but its form is equally important. Much may be done by utilization of mechanical devices to save time and energy. First, write in ink. Pencil marks blur badly and become illegible in a few months. Remember, you may be using the notebook 20 years hence, therefore make it durable. Second, write plainly. This injunction ought to be superfluous, for common sense tells us that writing which is illegible cannot be read even by the writer once it has grown cold. Third, take care in forming sentences. Do not make your notes consist simply of separate, scrappy jottings. True, it is difficult under stress to form complete sentences. The great temptation is to jot down a word here and there and trust to luck or an indulgent memory to supply the context at some later time. A little experience, however, will quickly demonstrate the futility of such hopes. Therefore, strive to form sensible phrases and to make the parts of the outline cohere. Apply the principle of English composition to the preparation of your notebook. A fourth question concerns size and shape of the notebook. These features depend partly upon the nature of the course and partly upon individual taste. It is often convenient and practicable to keep the notes for all courses in a single notebook. Men find it advantageous to use a small notebook of a size that can be carried in the coat pocket and studied at odd moments. A fifth question of a mix. Though most people understand more or less vaguely that the brain acts in some way during study, exact knowledge of the nature of this action is not general. As you will be greatly assisted in understanding mental processes by such knowledge, we shall briefly examine the brain and its connections. It will be manifestly impossible to inquire into its nature very minutely, but by means of a description, you will be able to secure some conception of it, and thus will be able better to control the mental processes which it underlies. To the naked eye, the brain is a large, jelly-like mass enclosed in a bony covering, about 1/4 of an inch thick, called the skull. Inside the skull, it is protected by a thick membrane. At its base emerges the spinal cord, a long strand of nerve fibers extending down the spine. For most of its length, the cord is about as large around as your little finger, but it tapers at the lower end. From it, at right angles throughout its length, branch out 31 pairs of fibrous nerves which radiate to all parts of the body. The brain and spinal cord, with all its ramifications, are known as the nervous system. You see now that though we started with the statement that the mind is intimately connected with the brain, we must now enlarge our statement and say it is connected with the entire nervous system. It is therefore to the nervous system that we must turn our attention. Although to the naked eye, the nervous system is apparently made up of a number of different kinds of material, still we see, when we turn our microscopes upon it, that its parts are structurally the same. Reduced to lowest terms, the nervous system is found to be composed of minute units of structure called nerve cells or neurons. Each of these looks like a string frayed out at both ends, with a bulge somewhere along its length. The nervous system is made up of millions of these little cells packed together in various combinations and distributed throughout the body. Some of the neurons are as long as 3 feet. Others measure but a fraction of an inch in length. We do not know exactly how the mind, that part of us which feels, reasons and wills, is connected with this mass of cells called the nervous system. We do know, however, that every time anything occurs in the mind, there is a change in some part of the nervous system. Applying this fact to study, it is obvious that when you are performing any of the operations of study, memorizing foreign vocabularies, making arithmetical calculations, reasoning out problems in geometry, you are making changes in your nervous system. The question before us then is, what is the nature of these changes? According to present knowledge, the action of the nervous system is best conceived as a form of chemical change that spreads among the nerve cells. We call this commotion the nervous current. It is very rapid, moving faster than 100 feet a second, and runs along the cells in much the same way as a spark runs along a train of gunpowder. It is important to note that neurons never act singly. They always act in groups. The nervous current passing from neuron to neuron. It is thought that the most important changes in the nervous system do not occur within the individual neurons, but at the points where they join with each other. This point of connection is called the synapse, and although we do not understand its exact nature, it may well be pictured as a valve that governs the passage of the nervous current from neuron to neuron. At time of birth, most of the valves are closed. Only a few are open, mainly those connected with the vegetative processes such as breathing and digestion. But as the individual is played upon by the objects of the environment, the valves open to the passage of the nervous current. With increased use, they become more and more permeable. And thus, learning is the process of making easier the passage of the nervous current from one neuron to another. We shall secure further light upon the action of the nervous system if we examine some of the properties belonging to nerve cells. The first one is impressibility. Nerve cells are very sensitive to impressions from the outside. If you have ever had the dentist touch an exposed nerve, you know how extreme this sensitivity is. Naturally, such a property is very important in education, for had we not the power to receive impressions from the outside world, we should not be able to acquire knowledge. We should not even be able to perceive danger and remove ourselves from harm. If we compare a man's body to a building, calling the steel framework his skeleton and the furnace and power station his digestive organs and lungs, the nervous system would include, with other things, the thermometers, heat regulators, electric buttons, doorbells, valve openers, the parts of the building, in short, which are specifically designed to respond to influences of the environment. The second property of nerve cells, which is important in study, is conductivity. As soon as a neuron is stimulated at one end, it communicates its excitement by means of the nervous current to the next neuron or to neighboring neurons, just as an electric current might pass along one wire, thence to another, and along it to a third. So the nervous current passes from neuron to neuron. As might be expected, the two functions of impressibility and conductivity are aided by such an arrangement of the nerve cells that the nervous current may pass over definitely laid pathways. These systems of pathways will be described in a later paragraph. The third property of nerve cells, which is important in study, is modifiability. That is, impressions made upon the nerve cells are retained. Most living tissue is modifiable to some extent. The features of the face are modifiable, and if one habitually assumes a peevish expression, it becomes, after a time, permanently fixed. The nervous system, however, possesses the power of modifiability to a marked degree, even a single impression sufficing to make striking modification. This is very important in study, being the basis for the retentive powers of the mind. Having examined the action of the nervous system in its simplicity, we have now to examine the ways in which the parts of the nervous system are combined. We shall be helped if we keep to the conception of it as an aggregation of systems or groups of pathways. Some of these we shall attempt to trace out, beginning with those at the outermost parts of the body. We find them located in the sense organs, not only within the traditional 5, but also within the muscles, tendons, joints, and internal organs of the body, such as the heart and digestive organs. In all these places, we find ends of neurons which converge at the spinal cord and travel to the brain. They are called sensory neurons, and their function is to carry messages inward to the brain. Thus, the brain represents in great part a central receiving station for impressions from the outside world. The nerve cells carrying messages from the various parts of the body terminate in particular areas. Thus, an area in These areas are quite clearly marked out and may be studied in detail by means of the accompanying diagram. There is another large group of nerve cells which, when traced out, are found to have one terminal in the brain and the other in the muscles throughout the body. The area in the brain where these neurons emerge is near the top of the brain in the area marked motor on the diagram. From here, the fibers travel down through the spinal cord and out to the muscles. The nerve cells in this group are called motor neurons, and their function is to carry messages from the brain out to the muscles, for a muscle ordinarily does not act without a nervous current to set it off. So far, we have seen that the brain has the two functions of receiving impressions from the sense organs and of sending out orders to the muscles. There is a further mechanism that must now be described. When messages are received in the sensory areas, it is necessary that there be some means within the brain of transmitting them over to the motor area so that they may be acted upon. Such an arrangement is provided by another group of nerve cells in the brain, having as their function the transmission of the nervous current from one area to another. They are called association neurons and transmit the nervous current from sensory areas to motor areas or from one sensory area to another. For example, suppose you see a brick falling from above and you dodge quickly back. The neural action accompanying this occurrence consists of an impression upon the nerve cells in the eye, the conduction of the nervous current back to the visual area of the brain, the transmission of the current over association neurons to the motor area, then its transmission over the motor neurons down the spinal cord to the muscles that enable you to dodge the missile. The association neurons have the further function of connecting one sensory area in the brain with another. For example, when you see, smell, taste, and touch an orange, the corresponding areas in the brain act in conjunction and are associated by means of the association neurons connecting them. The association neurons play a large part in the securing and organizing of knowledge. They are very important in study, for all learning consists in building up associations. From the foregoing description, we see that the nervous system consists merely of a mechanism for the reception and transmission of incoming messages and their transformation into outgoing messages which produce movement. The brain is the center where such transformations are made, being a sort of central switchboard which permits the sense organs to come into communication with muscles. It is also the instrument by means of which the impressions from, as already intimated, this book adopts the view that education is a process of forming habits in the brain. In the formation of habits, there are several principles that must be observed. Accordingly, we shall devote a chapter to the consideration of habits in general before discussing the specific habits involved in various kinds of study. Habits may be defined roughly as the tendency to act time after time in the same way. Thus defined, you see that the force of habit extends throughout the entire universe. It is a habit for the earth to revolve on its axis once every 24 hours and to encircle the sun once every year. When a pencil falls from your hand, it has a habit of dropping to the floor. A piece of paper once folded tends to crease in the same place. These are examples of the force of habit in non-living matter. Living matter shows its power even more clearly. If you assume a petulant expression for some time, it gets fixed and the expression becomes habitual. The hair may be trained to lie this way or that. These are examples of habit in living tissue. But there is one particular form of living tissue which is most susceptible to habit, that is nerve tissue. Let us review briefly the facts which underlie this characteristic. In nerve tissue, impressibility, conductivity, and modifiability are developed to a marked degree. The nerve cells in the sense organs are impressed by stimulations from the outside world. The nervous current thus generated is conducted over long nerve fibers through the spinal cord to the brain where it is received and we experience a sensation. Thence, it pushes on over association neurons in the brain to motor neurons, over which it passes down the spinal cord again to muscles and ends in some movement. In the pathway which it traverses, it leaves its impression, and thereafter, when the first neuron is excited, the nervous current tends to take the same pathway and to end in the same movement. It should be emphasized that the nervous current, once started, always tends to seek outlet in movement. This is an extremely important feature of neural action and, as will be shown in other chapter, is a vital factor in study. Movement may be started by the stimulation of a sense organ or by an idea. In the latter case, it starts from regions in the brain without the immediately preceding stimulation of a sense organ. Howsoever it starts, you may be sure that it seeks a way out and prefers pathways already traversed. Hence, you see, you are bound to have habits. They will develop whether you wish them or not. Already, you are a bundle of habits. They manifest themselves in two ways, as habits of action and habits of thought. You illustrate the first every time you tie your shoes or sign your name. To illustrate the second, I need only ask you to supply the end of this sentence. Columbus discovered America in dash. Speech reveals many of these habits of thought. Certain phrases persist in the mind as habits so that when the phrase is once begun, you proceed habitually with the rest of it. When someone starts in spite, your mind goes on to think of more or calls up less. When I ask you, what word is called up by black? You reply, white, according to the principles of mental habit. Your mind is arranged in such habitual patterns, and from these examples, you readily see that a large part of what you do and think during the course of 24 hours is habitual. 20 years hence, you will be even more bound by this overpowering despot. Our acts, our angels are, or good or ill, our constant shadows that walk with us still. Since you cannot avoid forming habits, how important it is that you seek to form those that are useful and desirable. In acquiring them, there are several general principles deducible from the facts of nervous action. The first is, guard the pathways leading to the brain. Nerve tissue is impressible and everything that touches it leaves an ineradicable trace. You cannot control your habits to some extent, then, by observing caution in permitting things to impress you. Many unfortunate habits of study arise from neglect of this. The habit of using a pony, for example, arises when one permits oneself to depend upon a group of English words in translating from a foreign language. Nerve pathways should then be guarded with respect to what enters. They should also be guarded with respect to the way things enter. Remember, as the first pathway is cut, subsequent nervous currents will be directed. The third maxim is never permit an exception to occur. Suppose you have a habit of saying ain't, which you wish to replace with the habit of saying isn't. If the habit is deeply rooted, you have worn a pathway in the brain to a considerable depth, represented in the accompanying diagram by the line AXB. Look at the above diagram. Let us suppose that you have already started the new habit and have said the correct word 10 times. That means you have worn another pathway AXC to a considerable depth. During all this time, however, the old pathway is still open and at the slightest provocation will attract the nervous current. Your task is to deepen the new path so that the nervous current will flow into it instead of the old. Now suppose you make an exemption on some occasion and allow the nervous current to travel over the old path. This unfortunate exception breaks down the bridge which you had constructed at X from A to C. But this is not the only result. The nervous current, as it revisits the old path, deepens it more than it was before. So the next time a similar situation arises, the current seeks the old path with much greater readiness than before, and vastly more effort is required to overcome it. Someone has likened the effect of these exceptions to that produced when one drops a ball of string that is partially wound. By a single slip, more is undone that can be accomplished in a dozen windings. The fourth maxim is, seize every opportunity to act upon your resolution. The reason for this will be understood better if you keep in mind the fact stated before, that nervous currents once started, whether from a sense organ or from a brain center, always tend to seek egress in movement. These outgoing nervous currents leave an imprint upon the modifiable nerve tissues as inevitably as do incoming impressions. Therefore, if you wish your resolve to be firmly fixed, you should act upon them speedily and often. It is not in the moment of their forming, but in the moment of their producing motor effects that resolves and aspirations communicate the new set to the brain. No matter how full a reservoir of maxim one may possess, and no matter how good one's sentiments may be, if one has not taken advantage of every concrete opportunity to act, one's character may remain entirely unaffected for the better. Particularly at time of emotional excitement, one makes resolves that are very good and a glow of fine feeling is present. Beware that these resolves do not evaporate in mere feelings. They should be crystallized in some form of action as soon as possible. Let the expression be the last thing in the world. Speaking genially to one's grandmother or giving up one's seat in a car. If nothing more heroic offers, but let it not fail to take place. Strictly speaking, you have not really completed a resolve until you have acted upon it. You may determine to go without lunch, but you have not consummated that resolve until you have permitted it to express itself by carrying you past the door of the dining room. That is the crucial test which determines the strength of your resolve. Many repetitions will be required before a pathway is worn deep enough to be settled. Seize the very earliest opportunity to begin grooving it out and seize every other opportunity for deepening it. After this view of the place in your life occupied by habit, you readily see its far-reaching possibilities for welfare of body and mind. It's most obvious because most annoying effects are on the side of its disadvantages. Bad habits secure a grip upon us that we are sometimes powerless to shake off. This ineradicableness need have no terrors if we have formed good habits. Indeed, as will be pointed out in the next paragraph, habit may be a great asset. Nevertheless, it may work positive harm, or at best may lead to stagnation. The fixedness of habit tends to make us move in roots unless we exert continuous effort to learn new things. If we permit ourselves to move in old grooves, we cease to progress and become old foggy. But the advantages of habit far outweigh its disadvantages. Habit helps the individual to be consistent and helps people to know what to expect from one. It helps society to be stable, to incorporate within itself modes of action conducive to the common good. For example, the respect which we all have for the property of others is a habit and is so firmly entrenched that we should find ourselves unable to steal if we wish to. Habit is thus a very desirable asset and is truly called the enormous flywheel of society. A second advantage of habit is that it makes for accuracy. Acts that have become habitualized and performed more accurately than those not habitualized. Movements such as those made in typewriting and piano playing, when measured in the psychological laboratory, are found to copy each other with extreme fidelity. The human body is a machine which may be adjusted to a high degree of nicety, and habit is the mechanism by which this adjustment is made. A third advantage is that a stock of habits makes life easier. There is no more miserable human being than one in whom nothing is habitual but indecision, for whom the lighting of every cigar, the drinking of every cup, the time of rising and going to bed every day, and the beginning of every bit of work are subjects of express volitional deliberation. Full half the time of such a man goes to the deciding or regretting of matters which ought to be so ingrained in him as practically not to exist for his consciousness at all. Have you ever reflected how miserable you would be and what a task living would be if you had to learn to write anew every morning when you go to class, or if you had to relearn how to tie your necktie every day? The burden of living would be intolerable. The last advantage to be discerned in habit is economy. Habitual acts do not have to be actively directed by consciousness. While they are being performed, consciousness may be otherwise engaged. The more of the details in our daily life we can hand over to the effortless custody of automatism, the more our high powers of mind will be set free for their own proper work. While you are brushing your hair or tying your shoes, your mind may be engaged in memorizing poetry or calculating arithmetical problems. Habit is thus a great economizer. The ethical consequences of habits are so striking that before leaving the subject, we must give them acknowledgement. We can do no better than to turn to the statement by Professor James, whose wise remarks upon the subject have not been improved upon. The physiological study of a mental condition is thus the most powerful ally of hortatory ethics, the hell to be endured hereafter, of which theology tells is no worse than the hell we make for ourselves in this world by habitually fashioning our characters in the wrong way. Could the young but realize how soon they will become mere walking bundles of habits, they would give more heed to their conduct while in the plastic state. We are spinning our own fates, good or evil, and never to be undone. Every smallest stroke of virtue or of vice leaves its never so little scar. The drunken Rip Van Winkle in Jefferson's play excuses himself for every fresh dereliction by saying, "I won't count this time." Well, he may not count it, and a kind heaven may not count it, but it is being counted nonetheless. Down among his nerve cells and fibers, the molecules are counting it, registering it, and storing it up to be used against him when the next temptation comes. Nothing we ever do is, in strict scientific literalness, wiped out. Of course, this has its good side as well as its bad one. As we become permanent drunkards by so many drinks, so we become saints in the moral, and authorities and experts in the practical and scientific spheres by so many separate acts and hours of work. But let no youth have any anxiety about the upshot of his education, whatever the line of it may be, if he keeps faithfully busy each hour of the working day. He may safely leave the final result to itself. He can, with perfect certainty, count on waking up some fine morning to find himself one of the competent ones of his generation in whatever pursuit he has singled out. Silently, between all the details of his business, the power of judging in all that class of matter will have built itself up within him as a position that will never pass away. Young people should know the truth of this in advance. The ignorance of it has probably engendered more discouragement and the faint-heartedness in youth embarking on arduous careers than all other causes put together. Exercise 1. Point out an undesirable habit that you are determined to eradicate. Describe the desirable habit which you will adopt in its place. Give the concrete steps you will take in forming the new habit. How long a time do you estimate will be required for the formation of the new habit? Mark down the date and refer back to it when you have formed the habit. A very large part of the mental life of a student consists in the manipulation of images. By images we mean the revivals of things that have been impressed upon the senses. Call to mind for the moment your house number as it appears upon the door of your home. In so doing, you mentally reinstate something which has been impressed upon your senses many times, and you see it almost as clearly as if it were actually before you. The mental thing thus revived is called an image. The word image is somewhat ill-chosen, for it usually signifies something connected with the eye and implies that the stuff of mental images is entirely visual. The true fact of the matter is, we can image practically anything that we can sense. We may have tactual images of things touched, auditory images of things heard, gustatory images of things tasted, olfactory images of things smelled. How these behave in general and how they interact in study will engage our attention in this chapter. The most highly dramatic use of images is in connection with that mental process known as imagination. As we study the writings of Jack London, Poe, Defoe, Bunyan, we move in a realm almost wholly imaginary. And as we take a cross-section of our minds when thus engaged, we find them filled with images. Furthermore, they are of great variety. Images of colors, sounds, tastes, smells, touches, even of sensations from our own internal organs, such as the palpitations of the heart that accompany feelings of pride, indignation, remorse, exaltation. A further characteristic is that they are sharp, clean-cut, vivid. Note, in the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet, the number, variety, and vividness of the images. But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and the Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief, that thou, her maid, art far more fair than she. Be not her maid, since she is envious. Her vestal livery is but sick and green. Two of the fairest stars in all the heaven, having some business, do entreat her eyes, to twinkle in their spheres till they return. What, if her eyes were there, they in her head? The brightness in her cheek would shame those stars. As daylight doth a lamp, her eyes in heaven would through the airy regions stream so bright that birds would sing and think it were not night. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. Oh, that I were a glove upon that hand, that I might touch that cheek. We may conclude then that three of the desirable attributes of great works of the imagination are number, variety, and vividness of mental images. One question that frequently arises concerning works of the imagination is, what is their source? Superficial thinkers have loosely answered inspiration, implying, according to the literal meaning of the word, to breathe in, that some mysterious external force, called by the ancient a muse, enters into the mind of the author with a special revelation. Psychological analysis of these imaginative works shows that this explanation is untrue, that the bizarre and apparently novel products arise from the experiences of the author, revived in imagination and combined in new ways. The horrendous incidents depicted in Dante's Divine Comedy never occurred within the lifetime experience of the author as such. Their separate elements did, however, and furnished the basis for Dante's clever combinations. The oft-heard saying that there is nothing new under the sun is psychologically true. In the light of this brief analysis of products of the imagination, we are ready to develop a program which may follow in cultivating an active imagination. Recognizing that images have their source in sensory experience, we see that the first step to take is to seek a multitude of experiences. Make intimate acquaintances with the objects of your environment. Handle them, tear them apart, put them together, place them next to other objects, noting the likenesses and differences. Thus, you will acquire the stuff out of which images are made and will stock your mind with a number of images. Then, when you wish to convey your ideas, you will have a number of terms in which to do it. one of the characteristics of a free-flowing imagination. The second characteristic we found to be variety. To secure this, seek a variety of sensational experiences. Perceive the objects of your experience through several senses: touch, smell, sight, hearing, taste. By means of this variety in sensations, you will secure corresponding variety in your images. To revive them easily sometimes requires practice, for it has been discovered that all people do not naturally call up images related to the various senses with equal ease. Most people use visual and auditory images more freely than they do other kinds. In order to develop skill in evoking the others, practice recalling them. Sit down for an hour of practice as you would sit down for an hour of piano practice. Try to recall the taste of raisins, English walnuts, the smell of hyacinths, of witch hazel, the rough touch of an orange skin. Though you may at first have difficulty, you will develop, with practice, a gratifying facility in recalling all varieties of images. The third characteristic which we observed in works of the imagination is vividness. To achieve this, pay close attention to the details of your sensory experiences. Observe sharply the minute but characteristic items. The accent mark on a pay, the coarse stubby beard of the typical alley tough. Stock your mind with a wealth of such detailed impressions. Keep them alive by the kind of practice recommended in the preceding paragraph. Then describe the objects of your experience in terms of these significant details. We discovered in discussing the source of imaginative works that the men whom we are accustomed to call imaginative geniuses do not have unique communication with heaven or with any external reservoir of ideas. Instead, we found their wonder-evoking creations to be merely new combinations of old images. The true secret of their success is their industrious utilization of past experiences according to the program outlined above. They select certain elements from their experiences and combine them in novel ways. This is the explanation of their strange, beautiful, and bizarre productions. This is what Carlyle meant when he characterized genius as the transcendent capacity for taking trouble. This is what Hogarth meant when he said, "Genius is nothing but labor and diligence." For concrete exemplification of this truth, we need only turn to the autobiographies of great writers. In this passage from John Barleycorn, Jack London describes his methods. Early and late, I was at it. Writing, typing, studying grammar, studying writing and all forms of writing, and studying the writers who succeeded in order to find out how they succeeded. I managed on 5 hours sleep in the 24 and came pretty close to working the 19 waking hours left to me by saying that the novel effects of imagination come by way of industry. We do not mean to imply that one should strain after novelty and eccentricity. Unusual and happy combinations will come of themselves and naturally if one only makes a sufficient number. There are laws of combination, known as the psychological laws of association, by which images will unite naturally. The number of possible combinations is infinite. By industriously making a large number, you will, by the very laws of chance, stumble upon some that are especially happy and striking. In summarizing this discussion, we may conclude that an active, fertile imagination comes from crowding into one's life a larger number of varied and vivid experiences, storing them up in the mind in the form of images, and industriously recalling and combining them in novel relationships. Mental images occur in other mental processes besides imagination. They bulk importantly in memorizing, as we shall see in chapters 6 and 7, and in reasoning, as we shall see in chapter 9. Throughout the book, we shall find that as we develop ability to manipulate mental images, we shall increase the adaptability of all the mental processes. Reading and exercises. Reading Dearborn 2, chapter 3. Exercise 1. Call up in the imagination of the sound of your French instructor's voice as he says, étudiant. Call up the appearance on the page of the conjugation of être, present tense. Exercise 2. Choose some word which you have had difficulty in learning. Look at it attentively, securing a perfectly clear impression of it. Then, practice calling up the visual image of it until you secure perfect reproduction. Exercise 3. List the different images called up by the passage from Romeo and Juliet. Of all the mental operations employed by the student, memory is probably the one in which the greatest inefficiency is manifested. Though we often fail to realize it, much of our life is taken up with memorizing. Every time we make use of past experience, we rely upon this function of the mind. But in no occupation is it quite so practically important as in study. We shall begin our investigation of memory by dividing it into 4 phases or stages: impression, retention, recall, and recognition. Any act of memory involves them all. There is a first stage when the material is being impressed. Second, a stage when it is being retained so that it may be revived in the future. Third, a stage of recall when the retained material is revived to meet present needs. Fourth, a feeling of recognition through which the material is recognized as having previously been in the mind. Impression is accomplished through the sense organs, and in the foregoing chapter we laid down the rule. Guard the avenues of impression and admit only such things as you wish to retain. This necessitates that you go slowly at first. This is a principle of all habit formation, but is especially important in habits of memorizing. Much of the poor memory that people complain about is due to the fact that they make first impressions carelessly. One reason why people fail to remember names is that they do not get a clear impression of the name at the start. They are introduced in a hurry or the introducer mumbles consequently. No clear impression is secured. Under such circumstances, how could one expect to retain and recall the name? Go slowly, then in impressing material for the first time. As you look up the words of a foreign language in the lexicon, trying to memorize their English equivalents take plenty of time. Obtain a clear impression of the sound and appearance of the words. Inasmuch as impressions may be made through any of the sense organs, one problem in the improvement of memory concerns the choice of sense avenues. As an infant, you used all senses impartially in your eager search after information. You voraciously put things into your mouth and discovered that some things were sweet, some sour. You bumped your head against things and learned that some were hard and some soft. In your insatiable curiosity, you pulled things apart and peered into them. In short, utilized all the sense organs. In adult life, however, and in education, as it takes place through the agency of books and instructors, most learning depends upon the eye and ear. Even yet, however, you learn many things through the sense of touch and through muscle movement. Though you may be unaware of it, you probably have better success retaining impressions made upon one sense than another. The majority of people retain better things that are visually impressed. Such persons think often in terms of visual images. When thinking of water running from a faucet, they can see the water fall, see it splash, but have no trace of the sound. The whole event is noiseless in memory. When they think of their instructor, they can see him standing at his desk but cannot imagine the sound of his voice. When striving to think of the cause leading to the Civil War, they picture them as they are listed on the page of the textbook or notebook. Other people have not this ability to recall in visual terms, but depend to greater extent upon sounds. When asked to think about their instructor, they do it in terms of his voice. When asked to conjugate a French verb, they hear it pronounced mentally but do not say it on the page. These are extremes of imagery types, but they illustrate preferences as they are found in many persons. Some persons use all senses with ease, Others unconsciously work out combinations, preferring one sense for some kinds of material and another for other kinds. For example, one might prefer visual impression for remembering dates in history, but auditory impression for conjugating French verbs. You will find it profitable to examine yourself and discover your preferences. If you find that you have greater difficulty in remembering material impressed through the ear than through the eye, reduce things to visual terms as much as possible. Make your lecture notes more complete or tabulate things that you wish to remember, thus securing impression from the written form. The writer has difficulty in remembering names that are only heard, so he asks that the name be spelled, then projects the letters on an imaginary background, thus forming visual stuff which can easily be recalled. If, on the contrary, you remember best the thing that you hear, you may find it a good plan to read your lessons aloud. Many a student, upon the discovery of such a preference, has increased his memory ability many folds by adopting the simple expedient of reading his lessons aloud. It might be pointed out that while you are reading aloud, you are making more than auditory impressions. By the use of the vocal organs, you are making muscular impressions, which also aid in learning, as will be pointed out in Chapter 10. After this discussion, do not jump to the conclusion that just because you find some difficulty in using one sense avenue for impression, it is therefore impossible to develop it. Facility in using particular senses can be gained by practice. To improve ability to form visual images of things, practice calling up visions of things. Try to picture a page of your history textbook. Can you see the headlines of the sections and the paragraphs? To develop auditory imagery, practice calling up sounds. Try to image your French instructor's voice in saying élève. The development of these sense fields is a slow and laborious process, and one questions whether it is worthwhile for a student to undertake the labor involved when another sense is already very efficient. Probably it is most economical to arrange impressions so as to favor the sense that is already well developed and reliable. Another important condition of impression is repetition. It is well known that material which is repeated several times is remembered more easily than that impressed but once. If 2 repetitions induce a given liability to recall, 4 or 8 will secure still greater liability of recall. Your knowledge of brain action makes this rule intelligible because you know the pathway is deepened every time the nervous current passes over it. Experiments in the psychological laboratory have shown that it is best in making impressions to make more than enough impressions to ensure recall. If material is to be retained for any length of time, a simple mastery of it for immediate recall is not sufficient. It should be learned far beyond the point of immediate reproduction if time and energy are to be saved. This principle of learning points out the fact that there are 2 kinds of memory, immediate and deferred. The first kind involves recall immediately after impression is made. The second involves recall at some later time. It is a well-known fact that things learned a long time before they are to be recalled fade away. If you are not going to recall material until a long time after the impression, store up enough impressions so that you can afford to lose a few and still retain enough until time for recall. Another reason for overlearning is that when the time comes for recall, you are likely to be disturbed. If it is a time of public performance, you may be embarrassed or you may be hurried or under distractions. Accordingly, you should have the material exceedingly well memorized so that these distractions will not prove detrimental. The mere statement made above that repetition is necessary in impression is not sufficient. It is important to know how to distribute the repetitions. Suppose you recall material until a long time after the impression. Suppose you are memorizing Psalm of Life to be recited a month from today, and that you require 30 repetitions of the poem to learn it. Shall you make 30 repetitions of the poem to learn it? Shall you make these 30 repetitions at one sitting, or shall you distribute them among several sittings? In general, it is better to spread the repetitions over a period of time. The question then arises, what is the most effective distribution? Various combinations are possible. You might rehearse the poem once a day during the month, or twice a day for the first 15 days, or the last 15 days, 4 times every 4th day, ad infinitum. In the face of these possibilities, is there anything that will guide us in distributing the repetitions? We shall get some light on the question from an examination of the curve of forgetting, a curve that has been plotted showing the rate at which the mind tends to forget. Forgetting proceeds according to law, the curve descending rapidly at first and then more slowly. The larger proportion of the material learned is forgotten the first day or so. After that, a constantly decreasing amount is forgotten on each succeeding day for perhaps a week, when the amount remains practically stationary. This gives us some indication that the early repetitions should be closer together than those at the end of the period. So long as you are forgetting rapidly, you will need more repetitions in order to counterbalance the tendency to forget. You might well make 5 repetitions, then rest. In about an hour, 5 more. Within the next 24 hours, 5 more. By this time, you should have the poem memorized, and all within 2 days. You would still have 15 repetitions of the 30, and these might be used in keeping the poem fresh in the mind by a repetition every other day. As intimated above, one important principle in memorizing is to make the first impressions as early as possible, for older impressions have many chances of being retained. This is evidenced by the vividness of childhood scenes in the minds of our grandparents. An old soldier recalls with great vividness events that happened during the Civil War, but forgets events of yesterday. There is involved here a principle of nervous action that you have already encountered, namely, that impressions are more easily made and retained in youth. It should also be observed that pathways made early have more chances of being used than those made recently. Still, another peculiarity of nervous action is revealed in these extended periods of memorizing. It has been discovered that if a rest is taken between impressions, the impressions become more firmly fixed. This points to the presence of a surprising power by which we are able to learn, as it were, while we sleep. We shall understand this better if we try to imagine what is happening in the nervous system. Processes of nutrition are constantly going on. The blood brings in particles to repair the nerve cells, rebuilding them according to the pattern left by the last impression. Indeed, the entrance of this new material makes the impression even more fixed. The nutritional processes seem to set the impression much as a hypobath fixes or sets an impression on a photographic plate. This peculiarity of memory led Professor James to suggest paradoxically that we learn to skate in summer and to swim in winter. And indeed, one usually finds in beginning the skating season that after the initial stiffness of muscles wears off, one glides along with surprising agility. You see then that if you plan things rightly, nature will do much of your learning for you. It might be suggested that perhaps things impressed just before going to sleep have a better chance to set than things impressed at other times, for the reason that sleep is the time when the reparative process of the body are most active. Since the brain pattern requires time to set, it is important that after the first impression, you refrain from introducing anything immediately into the mind that might disturb it. After you have impressed the poem you are memorizing, do not immediately follow it by another poem. Let the brain rest for 3 or 4 minutes until after the first impressions have had a chance to set. Now that we have regarded this unconscious memorizing from the neurological standpoint, let us consider it from the psychological. Before leaving the subject of theme writing, which was called up by the discussion of unconscious memory, another suggestion will be given that may be of service to you. When correcting a theme, employ more than one sense avenue. Do not simply glance over it with your eye. Read it aloud, either to yourself or, better still, to someone else. When you do this, you will be amazed to discover how different it sounds and what a new view you secure of it. When you thus change your method of composition, you will find a new group of ideas thronging into your mind. In the auditory rendition of a theme, you will discover faults of syntax which escaped you in silent readings. You will note duplication of words, split infinitives, mixed tenses, poorly balanced sentences. Moreover, if your mind has certain peculiarities, you may find even more advantages accruing from such a practice. The author, for example, has a slightly different set of ideas at his disposal according to the medium of expression employed. When writing with a pencil, one set of ideas comes to mind. With a typewriter, slightly different ideas arise. When talking to an audience, still different ideas. 3 sets of ideas and 3 vocabularies are thus available for use on any subject. In adopting this device of composing through several mediums, you should combine with it the principle of distributing time already discussed in connection with the repetition of impressions. Write a theme one day, then lay it aside for a few days and go back to it with a fresh mind. The rest will be found very beneficial in helping you to get a new viewpoint of the subject. Reverting to our discussion of the memory, we come upon another question. In memorizing material like the poem of our example, should one impress the entire poem at once or break it up into parts, impressing a stanza each day? Most people would respond without thought, the latter, and as a matter of fact, most memorizing takes place in this way. Experimental psychology, however, has discovered that this is uneconomical. The selection, if of moderate length, should be impressed as a whole. If too long for this, it should be broken up as little as possible. In order to see the necessity for this, let us examine your experiences with the memorization of poems in your early school days. You probably proceeded as follows. After school one day, you learned the first stanza, then went out to play. The next day, you learned the second one, and so on. You thought at the end of a week that you had memorized it because at the end of each day's sitting, you were able to recite perfectly the stanza learned that day. On speaking day, you started out bravely and recited the first stanza without mishap. When you started to think of the second one, however, it would not come. The memory barked. Now, what was the matter? How can we explain this distressing blank? In psychological terms, we ascribe the difficulty to the failure to make proper associations between stanzas. Association was made effectively between the lines of the single stanzas, but not between the separate stanzas. After you finished impressing the first stanza, you went about something else, playing ball perhaps. When you approached the poem the next day, you started in with the second stanza. There was then no bridge between the two. There was nothing to link the last line of the first stanza. And things are not what they seem. With the first line of the next stanza, life is real, life is earnest. This makes clear the necessity of impressing the poem as a whole instead of by parts. According to another classification, there are 2 ways of memorizing, by rote and by logical associations. Rote memorizing involves the repetition of material just as it stands and usually requires such long and laborious drill that it is seldom economical. True, some matter must be memorized this way, such as the days of the week and the names of the months. But there is another and gentler method which is usually more effective and economical than that of brutal repetition. That is the method of logical association. by which one links up a new fact with something already in the mind. If, for example, you wish to remember the date of the World's Fair in Chicago, you might proceed as follows. Ask yourself, what did the fair commemorate? The discovery of America in 1492, the 400th anniversary occurring in 1892. The fair could not be made ready in that year. However, so was postponed a year. Such a process of memorizing the date is less laborious than the method of rote memory and is usually more likely to lead to ready recall. Our discussion up to this point has centered around the phase of memory called impression. We have described some of the conditions favorable to impression and have seen that certain and accurate memory depends upon adherence to them. The next phase of memory, retention, cannot be described in psychological terms. We know we retain facts after they are once impressed, but as to their status in the mind, we can say nothing. If you were asked when the Declaration of Independence was signed, you would reply instantly. When asked, however, where that fact was 5 minutes ago, you could not answer. Somewhere in the recesses of the mind, perhaps, but as to immediate awareness of it, there was none. We may try to think of retention in terms of nerve cells and say that at the time when the material was first impressed, there was some modification made in certain nerve cells which persisted. This trait of nerve modifiability is one factor which accounts for greater retentive power in some persons than in others. It must not be concluded, however, that all good memory is due to the inheritance of this trait. It is due partly to observance of proper conditions of impressions, and much can be done to overcome or offset innate difficulty of modification by such observance. We are now ready to examine the third phase of memory, recall. This is the stage at which material that has been impressed and retained is recalled to serve the purpose for which it was memorized. Recall is thus the goal of memory, and all the devices so far discussed have it for their object. Can we facilitate recall by any other means than by faithful and intelligent impressions? For answer, let us examine the state of mind at the time of recall. We find that it is a unique mental state. It differs from impression in being a period of more active search for facts in the mind accompanied by expression, instead of a concentration upon the external impression. It is also usually accompanied by motor expressions, either talking or writing. Since recall is a unique mental state, you ought to prepare for it by means of a rehearsal. When you are memorizing anything to be recalled, make part of your memorizing a rehearsal of it, if possible, under same conditions as final recall. In memorizing from a book, first make impression, then close the book and practice recall. When memorizing a selection to be given in a public speaking class, intersperse the periods of impression with periods of recall. This is especially necessary in preparation for public speaking, for facing an audience gives rise to a vastly different psychic attitude from that of impression. The sight of an audience may be embarrassing or exciting. Furthermore, unforeseen distractions may arise. Accordingly, create those conditions as nearly as possible in your preparation. Imagine yourself facing the audience. Practice aloud so that you will become accustomed to the sound of your own voice. The importance of the practice of recall as a part of the memory process can hardly be overestimated. One psychologist has advised that in memorizing significant material, more than half the time should be spent in practicing recall. There still remains a fourth phase of memory, recognition. Whenever a remembered fact is recalled, it is accompanied by a characteristic feeling which we call the feeling of recognition. It has been described as a feeling of familiarity, a glow of warmth, a sense of ownership, a feeling of intimacy. As you walk down the street of a great city, you pass hundreds of faces, all of them strange. Suddenly, in the crowd, you catch sight of someone you know and are instantly suffused with a glow of feeling that is markedly different from your feeling toward the others. That glow represents the feeling of recognition. It is always present during recall and may be used in great advantage in studying. It derives its virtue for our purpose from the fact that it is a feeling, and at the time of feeling, the bodily activities in general are affected. Changes occur in heartbeat, breathing, various glandular secretions are affected. The digestive organs respond. In this general quickening of bodily activity, we have reason to believe that the nervous system partakes and things become impressed more readily. Thus, the feeling of recognition that accompanies recall is responsible for one of the benefits of reviews. At such a time, material once memorized becomes tinged with a feelingful color different from that which accompanied it when new. Review, then, not merely to produce additional impressions, but also to take advantage of the feeling of recognition. We have now discussed memory in its 4 phases and have seen clearly that it operates not in a blind, chaotic manner, but according to law. Certain conditions are required, and when they are met, memory is good. After providing proper conditions for memory, then trust your memory. An attitude of confidence is very necessary. If, when you are memorizing, you continually tremble for fear that you will not recall at the desired moment, the fixedness of the impression will be greatly hindered. Therefore, after utilizing all your knowledge about the conditions of memorizing, rest content and trust to the laws of nature. They will not fail you. By this time, you have seen that memory is not a mysterious mental faculty with which some people are generously endowed and of which others are deprived. All people of normal intelligence can remember and can improve their ability if they desire. The improvement does not take the form that some people expect, however. No magic wand can transform you into a good memorizers. You must work the transformation yourself. Furthermore, it is not an instantaneous process to be accomplished overnight. It will come about only after you have built up a set of habits, according to our conception of study, as a process of habit formation. A final word of caution should be added. Some people think of memory as a separate division or compartment of the mind, which can be controlled and improved by exercising it alone. Such a conception is fallacious. Improvement in memory will involve improvement in other mental abilities, and you will find that as you improve your ability to remember, you will develop at the same time better powers to concentrate attention, to image, to associate facts, and to reason. Readings and exercises. Reading. See readings for chapter 6. Exercise 1. Compare the mental conditions of impressions with those of recall. Nearly everyone has difficulty in the concentration of attention. Brain workers in business and industry, students in high school and college, and even professors in universities complain of the same difficulty. Attention seems in some way to be at the very core of mental activity, for no matter from what aspect we view the mind, its excellence seems to depend upon the power to concentrate attention. Attention seems in some way to be at the very core of mental activity, for no matter from what aspect we view the mind, its excellence seems to depend upon the power to concentrate attention. When we examine a growing infant, one of the first signs by which we judge the awakening of intelligence is the power to pay attention or to notice things. When we examine the intellectual ability of normal adults, we do so by means of tests that require close concentration of attention. In judging the intelligence of people with whom we associate every day, we regard one who is able to maintain close attention for long periods of time as a person of strong mind. We rate Thomas Edison as a powerful thinker when we read that he becomes so absorbed in work that he neither eats nor sleeps. Finally, when we examine the insane and the feeble-minded, we find that one form which their derangements Take is an inability to control the attention. This evidence, added to our own experience, shows us the importance of concentration of attention in study, and we become even more desirous of investigating attention to see how we may develop it. We shall be better able to discuss attention if we select for analysis a concrete situation when the mind is in a state of concentrated attention. Concentrate for a moment upon the letter O. Although you are ostensibly focusing all your powers of attention upon the letter, nevertheless you are really aware of a number of things besides, of other words on the page, of other objects in the field of vision, of sounds in the room and on the street, of sensations from your clothing, and of sensations from your bodily organs, such as the heart and lungs. In addition to these sensations, you will find, if you introspect carefully enough, that your mind also contains a number of ideas and imaginings, thoughts about the paragraph you just read or about one of your lessons. Thus, we see that at a time when we apparently focus our attention upon but one thing, we really have a large number of things in our mind, and they are of great variety. The mental field might be represented by a circle, at the center of which is the object of attention. It may be an object in the external world perceived through one of the senses, or it may be an idea we are thinking about, such, for example, as the idea of infinity. But whether the thing attended to it a perception or an idea, we may properly speak of it as the object of attention or the focal object. In addition to this, we must recognize the presence of a large number of other objects, both sensory and ideational. These are nearer and margin of the mental field, so we call them marginal. The distinctive thing about a state of mind such as that just described is that the focal object is much clearer than the marginal objects. For example, when you fixated the letter O, it was only in the vaguest sort of fashion that you were aware of the contact of your clothing or the lurking idea of other lessons. As we examine these marginal objects further, we find that they are continually seeking to crowd into the center of attention and to become clear. You may be helped in forming a vivid picture of conditions if you think of the mind as a stream ever in motion, and as it flows on, the objects in it continually shift their positions. A cross-section of the stream at any moment may show the contents of the mind arranged in a particular pattern, but at the very next moment, they may be arranged in a different pattern, another object occupying the focus, while the previous tenant is pushed to the margin. Thus, we see that it is a tendency of the mind to be forever changing. If left to itself, it would be in ceaseless fluctuation, the whim of every passing fancy. This tendency to fluctuate comes with more or less regularity. Some psychologists say every second or two. True, we do not always yield to the fluctuating tendency. Nevertheless, we are recurrently tempted, and we must exercise continuous effort to keep a particular object at the focus. The power to exert effort and to regulate the arrangement of our states of mind is the peculiar gift of man and is a prime function of education. Viewed in this light, then, we see that the voluntary focusing of our attention consists in the selecting of certain objects to be attended to and the ignoring of other objects which act as distractions. We may conveniently classify the latter as external sensations, bodily sensations, and irrelevant ideas. Let us take an actual situation that may arise in study and see how this applies. Suppose you are in your room studying about Charlemagne, a page of your history text occupying the center of your attention. The marginal distractions in such a case would consist first, in external sensations such as the glare from your study lamp, the hissing of the radiator, the practicing of a neighboring vocalist, the rattle of passing street cars. The bodily distractions might consist of sensations of weariness referred to the back, the arms and the eyes, and fainter sensations from the digestive organs, heart, and lungs. The irrelevant ideas might consist of thoughts about a German lesson which you are going to study, visions of a face, or thoughts about some social engagement. These marginal objects are in the mind even when you consciously focus your mind upon the history lesson, and though vague, they try to force their way into the focus and become clear. The task of paying attention then consists in maintaining the desired object at the center of the mental field and keeping the distractions away. With this definition of attention, we see that in order to increase the effectiveness of attention during study, we must devise means for overcoming the distractions peculiar to study. Obviously, the first thing is to eliminate every distraction possible. Such a plan of elimination may require a radical rearrangement of study conditions, for students often fail to realize how wretched their conditions of study are from a psychological standpoint. They attempt to study in rooms with 2 or 3 others who talk and move about continually. They drop down in any spot in the library and expose themselves needlessly to a great number of distractions. If you wish to become a good student, you must prepare conditions as favorable as possible for study. Choose a quiet room to live in, free from distracting sounds and sights. Have your room at a temperature neither too hot nor too cold. 68 degrees Fahrenheit is usually considered favorable for study. When reading in the library, sit down in a quiet spot with your back to the door so you will not be tempted to look up as people enter the room. Do not sit near a group of gossipers or near a creaking door. Having made the external conditions favorable for study, you should next address yourself to the task of eliminating bodily distractions. The most disturbing of these in study are sensations of fatigue, for contrary to the opinion of many people, study is very fatiguing work and involves continual strain upon the muscle in holding the body still, particularly those of the back, neck, arms, hands, and above all, the eyes. How many movements are made by your eyes in the course of an hour's study? They sweep back and forth across the page incessantly, being moved by 6 muscles which are bound to become fatigued. Still more fatigue comes from the contractions of delicate muscles within the eyeball, where adjustments are made for far and near vision and for varying amounts of light. The eyes then give rise to much fatigue and altogether are the source of a great many bodily distractions in study. Other distractions may consist of sensations from the clothing. We are always vaguely aware of the pressure of our clothing. Usually, it is not sufficiently noticeable to cause much annoyance, but occasionally it is, as it demonstrated at night when we take off a shoe with such a sigh of relief that we realize in retrospect it had been vaguely troubling us all day. In trying to create conditions for efficient study, many bodily distractions can be eliminated. The study chair should be easy to sit in so as to reduce fatigue of the muscles supporting the body. The book rest should be arranged so as to require little effort to hold the book. The light should come over the left shoulder. This is especially necessary in writing, so that the writing hand will not cast a shadow upon the work. The muscles of the eye will be rested and fatigue will be retarded if you close the eyes occasionally. Then, in order to lessen the general fatigue of the body, you may find it advantageous to rise and walk about occasionally. Lastly, the clothing should be loose and unconfining, especially should there be plenty of room for circulation. In the overcoming of distraction, we have seen that much may be done by way of eliminating distractions, and we have pointed out the way to accomplish this to a certain extent. But in spite of our most careful provisions, there will still be distractions that cannot be eliminated. You cannot, for example, chloroform the vocalist in the neighboring apartment, nor stop the street cars while you study. You cannot rule out fatigue sensations entirely, and you cannot build a fence around the focus of your mind so as to keep out unwelcome and irrelevant ideas. The only thing to do then is to accept as inevitable the presence of some distractions and to realize that to pay attention, it is necessary to habituate yourself to the ignoring of distractions. In the accomplishment of this end, it will be necessary to apply the principles of habit formation already described. Start out by making a strong determination to ignore all distractions. Practice ignoring them and do not let a slip occur. Try to develop interest in the object of attention because we pay attention to those things in which we are most interested. A final point that may help you is to use the first lapse of attention as a reminder of the object you desire to fixate upon. This may be illustrated by the following example. Suppose, in studying a history lesson, you come upon a reference to the royal apparel of Charlemagne. The word royal might call up purple, a Northwestern University pennant, the person who gave it to you, and before you know it, you are off in a long daydream leading far from the history lesson. Such migrations as these are very likely to occur in study and constitute one of the most treacherous pitfalls of student life. In trying to avoid them, you must form habits of disregarding irrelevant ideas when they try to obtrude themselves. And the way to do this is to school yourself so that the first lapse of attention will remind you of the lesson in hand. It can be done if you keep yourself sensitive to wanderings of attention and let the first slip from the topic with which you are engaged remind you to pull yourself back. Do this before you have taken the step that will carry you far away. For with each step in the series of associations, it becomes harder to draw yourself back into the correct channel. In reading, one frequent cause for lapses of attention and for the intrusion of unwelcome ideas is obscurity in the material being read. If you trace back your lapses of attention, you will often find that they first occur when the thought becomes difficult to follow, the sentence ambiguous, or a single word unusual. As a result, the meaning grows hazy in your mind and you fail to comprehend it. Naturally, then, you drift into a channel of thought that is easier to follow. This happens because the mental stream tends to seek channels of least resistance. If you introspect carefully, you will undoubtedly discover that many of your annoying lapses of attention can be traced to such conditions. The obvious remedy is to make sure that you understand everything as you read. As soon as you feel the thought growing difficult to follow, begin to exert more effort. Consult the dictionary for the meanings of words you do not understand. Probably, the ordinary freshman in college ought to look up the meaning of as many as 20 words daily. Again, the thought may be difficult to follow because your previous knowledge is deficient. Perhaps the discussion involves some fact which you never did comprehend clearly, and you will naturally fail to understand. If you were asked to describe the most embarrassing of your classroom experiences, you would probably cite the occasions when the instructor asked you a series of questions demanding close reasonings. As he pins you down to statement of facts and forces you to draw valid conclusions, you feel in a most perplexed frame of mind. Either you find yourself unable to give reasons or you entangle yourself in contradictions. In short, you flounder about helplessly and feel as though the bottom of your ship of knowledge has dropped out. And when the ordeal is over and you have made a miserable botch of recitation which you thought you had been perfectly prepared for, you complain that if the instructor had followed the book or if he had asked straight questions, you would have answered everyone perfectly, having memorized the lesson word for word. This complaint, so often voiced by students, reveals the fundamental characteristics which distinguishes the mental operations of reasoning from the others we have studied. In reasoning, we face a new kind of situation presenting difficulties not encountered in the simpler processes of sensation, memory, and imagery, and when we attempt to substitute these simple processes for reasoning, we fail miserably. For the two kinds of processes are essentially different and cannot be substituted one for the other. Broadly speaking, the mental activities of a study may be divided into two groups, which, for want of better names, we shall call processes of acquisition and processes of construction. The mental attitude of the first is that of acquirement. Sometimes our main business seems to be to acquire knowledge. Certain matters are placed before us in book or by our teachers, and we are required to master them. To make them part of our stock of knowledge, we are required to master them. At other times, we are called upon to use the knowledge we already possess in order to attain some end that is set before us. In geography, for example, so long as we are merely learning the bare facts of the subject, the size, contours of the different continents, the political divisions, the natural features, we are at the exquisitive stage. But when we go on to try to find out the reasons why certain facts that we have learned should be as they are and not otherwise, we pass to the constructive stage. We are working constructively when we seek to discover why it is that great cities are so often found on the banks of rivers, why peninsulas more frequently turn southward than northward. You readily see that this constructive method of study involves the setting and solving of problems as its distinguishing feature, and that in the solution of these problems we make use of reason. A little reflection will show that though there is a distinct difference between processes of acquisition and of construction, nevertheless, the two must not be regarded as entirely separate from each other. In acquiring new facts, we must always use a little reason, while in constructive work, we cannot always rely upon having all the necessary matter ready to hand. We have frequently to stop our constructive work for a little in order to acquire some new facts that we find to be necessary. Thus, we acquire a certain number of new facts while we are reasoning about things, and while we are engaged in acquiring new matter, we must use our reason at least to some small extent. The two overlap then, but there is a difference between them from the standpoint of the student, and the terms denote two fundamentally different attitudes which students take in study. The two attitudes may be illustrated by contrasting the two methods often used in studying geometry. Some students memorize the theorem and the steps in the demonstration, reciting them verbatim at the class hour. Others do not memorize but reason out each step to see its relation to the preceding step, and when they see it must necessarily follow, they pass on to the next and do the same. These two types of students apparently arrive at the same conclusions, but the mental operations leading up to the QED of each are vastly different. The one student does his studying by the rote memory method, the other by the road of reasoning. The former road is usually considered the easier, and so we find it most frequently followed. To memorize a table, a definition, or a series of dates is relatively easy. One knows exactly where one is and can keep track of one's progress and test one's success. Some people are attracted by such a task and perfectly happy to follow this plan of study. The kind of mind that contents itself with such phonographic records, however, must be acknowledged. Now that we have found the reasoning process to be one of the problem solving, of which the first step is to acknowledge and recognize the difficulty, the second, to call up various methods of solution, and the third, to decide on the basis of one of the solutions that comes tinged with certainty. We are ready to apply this schema to study in the hope that we may discover the causes and remedies for the reasoning difficulties of students. In view of the fact that reasoning starts out with a problem, you see at once that you make your study effective, you must study in problems. Avoid an habitual attitude of mere acquisition. Do not memorize facts in the same pattern as they are handed out to you. In history, in general literature, in science, do not read facts merely as they come in the text, but seek the relations between them. Voluntarily set before yourself intellectual problems. Ask yourself, why is this so? In other words, in your study, do not merely acquire but also construct. The former makes use mostly of memory, and though your memorizing be done ever so consciously, if it comprises the main part of your study, you fail to utilize your mind to its fullest extent. Let us now consider the second stage of the reasoning process as found in study. At this stage, the facts in the mind are brought forward for the purpose of being fitted into the present situation. And the essential thing is that you have a large number of facts at your disposal. If you are going to reason effectively about problems in history, mathematics, geography, it is absolutely indispensable that you know many facts about the subject. One reason why you experience difficulty in reasoning about certain subjects is that you don't know enough about them. Particularly is this true in such subjects as political economy, sociology, and psychology. The results of such ignorance are often demonstrated in political and social movements. Why do the masses so easily fall victims to doubtful reforms in national and municipal policies? Because they do not know enough about these matters to reason intelligently. Watch ignorant people listening to a demagogue and see what unreasonable things they accept. The speaker propounds a question and then proceeds to answer it in his own way. He makes it appear plausible, assuring his hearers it is the only way, and they agree because they do not have enough other facts at their command to refute it. They are unable, as we say, to see the situation in several aspects. The mistakes in reasoning which children make have a similar basis. The child reaches for the moon, reasoning, here is something bright. I can touch most bright things. Therefore, I can touch this. His reasoning is fallacious because he does not have all the facts. This condition is paralleled in the classroom when students make what are shamefacedly looked back upon as miserable blunders. When one of these fiascos occurs, the cause can many times be referred to the fact that the student did not have enough facts at his command. Speaking broadly, the most effective reasoning in a field can be done by one who has had the most extensive experiences in that field. If one had complete acquaintance with all facts, one would have perfect conditions for reasoning. Thus, we see that effectiveness in reasoning demands an extensive array of facts. Accordingly, in your courses of study, you must read with avidity. When you are given a list of readings in a course, some of which are required and some optional, read both sets. And every new fact thus secured will make you better able to reason in the field. But good reasoning demands more than mere quantity of ideas. The ideas must conform to certain qualitative standards before they may be effectively employed in reasoning. They must arise with promptness, in an orderly manner, pertinent to the matter in hand, and they must be clear. In securing promptness of association on the part of your ideas, employ the methods described in the chapter on memory. Make many logical associations with clearness and repetition. In order to ensure the rise of ideas in an orderly manner, pay attention to the manner in which you acquire them. Remember, things will be recalled as they were impressed. So, the value of your ideas in reasoning will depend upon the manner in which you make original impressions. A further characteristic of serviceable ideas is clarity. Ideas are sometimes described as clear, in opposition to muddy. You know what is meant by these distinctions, and you may be assured that one cause for your failures in reasoning is that your ideas are not clear. This manifests itself in inability to make clear statements and to comprehend clearly. The latter condition is easily illustrated. When you began the study of geometry, you faced a multitude of new terms. We call them technical terms, such as projection, scalene, theory of limits. These had to be clearly understood before you could reason in the subject. And when, in the progress of your study, you experienced difficulty in reasoning out problems, it was very likely due to the fact that you did not master that technical terms. And as soon as you encountered the difficulties of the course, you failed because your foundation laying did not involve the acquisition of clear ideas. Examine your difficulties in reasoning subjects, and if you find them traceable to vagueness of ideas, take steps to clarify them. Ideas may be clarified in two ways: by definition and by classification. Definition is a familiar device, for you have had much to do with it in learning. The memorization of definition is an excellent practice, not as an end in itself, but as a means to the end of effective reasoning. Throughout your study, then pay much attention to definitions. Some you will find in your text, but others you will have to make for yourself. In order to get practice in this, undertake the manufacture of a few definitions using terms such as charity, benevolence, natural selection. This exercise will reveal what an exacting mental operation definition is and will prove how vague most of your thinking really is. A large stock of definitions will help you to think rapidly, standing as they do for a large group of experiences. Definitions are a mean of mental economy. For illustration of their service in reasoning, suppose you were asked to compare the serf, the peon, and the American slave. If you have a clean-cut definition of each of these terms, you can readily differentiate between them. But if you cannot define them, you will hardly be able to reason concerning them. The second means of clarifying ideas is classification. By this is meant the process of grouping similar ideas or similar points of ideas. For example, your ideas of serf, peon, and slave have some points in common. Group the ideas then with reference to these points. Then in reasoning, you can quickly place an idea in its proper group. The third stage of the reasoning process is decision, based on belief, and it comes inevitably, provided the other two processes have been performed rightly. Accordingly, we need say little about its place in study. One caution should be pointed out in making decisions. Do not make them hastily on the basis of only one or two facts. Wait until you have uncanvassed all the idea that bear importantly upon the case. The masses that listen top eagerly to the demagogue do not err merely from lack of ideas, but partly because they do not utilize all the facts at their disposal. This fault is frequently discernible in impulsive people who notoriously make snap judgments, which means that they decide before canvassing all the evidence. This trait marks the fundamental difference between superficial and profound thinkers. The former accept surface facts and decide immediately, while the latter refuse to decide until after canvassing of many facts. In the improvement of reasoning ability, your task is mainly one of habit formation. It is necessary, first, to form the habit of stating things in the form of problems. Second, to form habits by which ideas arise promptly and profusely. Third, to form habits of reserving decisions until the important facts are in. These are all specific habits that must be built up if the reasoning processes of the mind are to be effective. Already you have formed some habits. If not habits of careful looking into things, then habits of hasty, heedless, impatient glancing over the surface. Apply the principles of habit formation already enunciated, and remember that with every act of reasoning you perform, you are molding yourself into a careless reasoner or an accurate after canvassing many facts, or an accurate reasoner into a clear thinker or a muddy thinker. This chapter shows that reasoning is one of the highest powers of man. It is a mark of originality and intelligence and stamps its possessor not a copier but an originator, not a follower but a leader, not a slave to have his thinking foisted upon him by others, but a free and independent intellect, unshackled by the bonds of ignorance and convention. The man who employs reason in acquiring knowledge finds delights in study that are denied to a rote memorizer. When one looks at the world through glasses of reason, inquiring into the eternal why, Then facts take on a new meaning. Knowledge comes with new power. The facts of experience glow with vitality, and one's own relations with them appear in a new light. In our discussion of the nervous basis underlying study, we observed that nerve pathways are affected not only by enters over the sensory pathways but also by what flows out over the motor pathways. As the nerve current travel out from the motor centers in the brain to the muscles, they leave traces which modify future thoughts and actions. This being so, it is easy to see that what we give out is fully as important as what we take in. In other words, our expressions are just as important as our impressions. By expressions, we mean the motor consequences of our own thoughts, and in study, they usually take the form of speech and writing of a kind to be specified later. The far-reaching effects of motor expressions are too infrequently emphasized, but psychology forces us to give them prime consideration. We are first apprised of their importance when we study the nervous system and find that every incoming sensory message push on and on until it finds a motor pathway over which it may travel and produce movement. This is inevitable. The very structure and arrangement of the neurons is such that we are obliged to make some movement in response to objects affecting our sense organs. The extent of movement may vary from the widespread tremors that occur when we are frightened by a thunderstorm to the merest flicker of an eyelash. But whatever be its extent, movement invariably occurs when we are stimulated by some object. This has been demonstrated in startling ways in the psychological laboratory, where even so simple a thing as a piece of figured wallpaper has been shown to produce measurable bodily disturbances. Ordinarily, we do not notice these because they are so slight, sometimes being merely twitches of deep-seated muscles or slight enlargements or contractions of arteries which are very responsive to nerve currents. But no matter how large or how small, we may be sure that movements always occur on the excitation of sense organ. This led us to assert in an earlier chapter that the function of the nervous system is to convert incoming sensory currents into outgoing motor currents. So ingrained is this tendency toward movement that we do not need even a sensory cue to start it off. An idea will do as well. In other words, the nervous current need not start at a sense organ but may start in the brain and still produce movement. This fact is embodied in the law of ideomotor action, distinguished from sensory motor action. Every idea in the mind tends to express itself in movement. This motor character of ideas is manifested in a most thoroughgoing way and renders our muscular system a faithful mirror of our thoughts. We have in the psychological laboratory delicate apparatus which enables us to measure many of these slight movements. For example, we fasten a recording device to the top of a person's head so that his slightest movements will be recorded. Then we ask him while standing perfectly still to think of an object at his right side. After several moments, the record shows that he involuntarily leans in the direction of the object about which he is thinking. We find further illustrations of this law when we examine people as they read, for they involuntarily accompany the reading with movements of speech measurable in the muscles of the throat, the tongue, and the lips. These facts and many others constitute good evidence for the statement that ideas seek expression in movement. The ethical consequences of this are so momentous that we must remark upon them in passing. We now see the force of the biblical statement, "Not that which entereth into the mouth defileth the man, but that which proceedeth out of the mouth, this defileth the man." Think what it means to one's character that every thought hardboard in the mind is bound to come out. It may not manifest itself at once in overt action, but it affects the motor pathways and either weakens or strengthens connections so that when the opportunity comes, some act will be furthered or hindered. In view of the proneness to permit base thoughts to enter the mind, human beings might sometimes fear even to think. A more optimistic idea, however, is that noble thought lead to noble acts. Therefore, keep in your mind the kind of thoughts that you wish to see actualized in your character, and the appropriate acts will follow of their own accord. But it is with the significance of expressions in study that we are at present concerned, and here we find them of supreme importance. We ordinarily regard learning as a process of taking things into the mind, and regard expression as a thing apart from acquisition of knowledge. We shall find in this discussion, however, that there is no such sharp demarcation between acquiring knowledge and expressing knowledge, but that the two are intimately bound together, expressions being properly a part of wise and economical learning. When we survey the modes of expressions that may be used in study, we find them to be of several kinds. Speech is one. This is the form of expression for which the class recitation is provided. If you wish to grow as a student, utilize the recitation period and welcome every chance to recite orally, for things about which you recite in class are more effectively learned. Talking about a subject under all circumstances will help you learn. When studying subjects like political economy, sociology, or psychology, seize every opportunity to talk over the questions involved. Hold frequent conferences with your instructor, voice your difficulties freely, and the very effort to state them will help to clarify them. It is a good plan for two students in the same course to come together and talk over the problems. The debates thus stimulated and the questions aroused by mental interactions are very helpful in impressing facts more vividly upon the mind. Writing is a form of expression and is one thing that gives value to note-taking and examinations. Its value is further recognized by the requirements of themes and term papers. These are all mediums by which you may develop yourself, and they merit your earnest cooperation. Another medium of expression that students may profitably employ is drawing. This is especially valuable in such subjects as geology, physiology, and botany. Students in botany are compelled to do much drawing of the plant forms which they study, and this is a wise requirement, for it makes them observe more carefully, report more faithfully, and recall with greater ease. You may secure the same advantages by employing the graphic method in other studies. For example, when reading in a geology textbook about the stratification of the earth in a certain region, draw the parts described and label them according to the description. You will be surprised to see how clear the description becomes and how easily it is later recalled. Let us examine the effects of the expressive movements of speech, writing, and the like, and see the mechanism by which they facilitate the study process. We may describe their effects in two ways, neurologically and psychologically. As may be expected from a preliminary study of the nervous system, we see their first effects upon the motor pathways leading out to the muscles. Each passage of the nerve current from brain to muscle leave traces so that the resulting act is performed with greater ease upon each repetition. This fact has already been emphasized by the warning, guard the avenues of expression. Especially is it important at the first performance of an act, because this determines the path of later performances. In such studies as piano playing, vocalizing, and pronunciation of foreign words, see that your first performance is absolutely right. Then, as the expressive movements are repeated, they will be more firmly ingrained because of the deepening of the motor pathways. The next effect of acts of expression is to be found in the modifications made in the sensory areas of the brain. You will recall that every movement of a muscle produces nervous currents which go back to the brain and register there in the form of kinesthetic sensation. To demonstrate kinesthetic sensations, close your eyes and move your index fingers up and down. You can feel the muscles contracting and the tendons move back and forth, even into the back of the hand. These sensations ordinarily escape our attention, but they occupy a prominent place in the control of our actions. For example, when ascending familiar stairs in the dark, They notify us when we have reached the top. We are still further impressed with their importance when we are deprived of them. When we try to walk upon a foot or a leg that has gone to sleep, that is, when the kinesthetic nerves are temporarily paralyzed. We find it difficult to walk, but besides being used to control muscular action, they may be used in study, for they may be made the source of impressions, and impressions, as we learned in the chapter on memory, are a prime requisite for learning. Each expression becomes then, through its kinesthetic results, the source of new impressions. When, for example, you pronounce the German word anwenden with the English word to employ, in addition to the impressions made through the ear, you make impressions through the muscles of speech, kinesthetic impressions, and these kinesthetic impressions enter into the body of your knowledge, and later may serve as the means by which the word may be revived. When you write the word, you make kinesthetic impressions which may later serve as forms of revival. So the movements of expression produce sensory material that may serve as tentacles by means of which, and impressions, as we learned in the chapter, by means of which you can later reach back into your memory and recall facts. We shall now consider another service of expressions which, though little regarded, nevertheless is of much moment. When we make expressive movements, much nervous energy is generated, much more than during a passive impression. Energy is sent back to the brain over the kinesthetic nerve cells, and the greater the extent of the movement, the greater is the amount of new energy sent to the brain. It pours into the brain and diffuses itself especially throughout the association areas. Here it excites regions which could not be excited by a more limited amount of energy. This means, in physical terms, that new ideas are being aroused. The obvious inference from this fact is that you may, by starting movements of expressions, actually summon to your assistance added powers of mind. For example, when you are called upon to recite in class, your mind seems to be a complete blank, in a state of deadlock. You may break this deadlock and start brain action by some kind of movement. It may be only to clear your throat, to ejaculate well, or to squirm about in the seat. But whatever form the movement takes, it will usually be effective in creating the desired nervous energy, and after the inertia is once overcome, the mental stream will flow freely. The unconscious application of this device is seen when a man is called on suddenly to make a speech for which he has not prepared. He usually starts out by telling a story, thus liberating nervous energy to pour back into the brain and start thinking process. With increasing vehemence of expression, the ideas come more and more freely, and the result is a speech which surpasses the expectation of the speaker himself. The gesticulations of many speakers have this same function, being frequently of great service in arousing more nervous energy, which goes back to the brain and arouses more ideas. The device of stimulating ideas by expressive movements may be utilized in theme or letter writing. It is generally recognized that the difficult thing in such writing is to get a start, and the too common practice is to sit listlessly, gazing into space, waiting for inspiration. This is usually a futile procedure. The better way is to begin to write anything about the topic in hand. What you write may have little merit, either of substance or form. Nevertheless, if you persist in keeping up the activity of writing, making more and more movements, you will find that the ideas will begin to come in greater profusion until they come so fast you can hardly write them down. Having tried to picture the neural effect of expression, we may now translate them into psychological terms, asking what service the expressions render to the conscious side of our study. First of all, we note that the expressions help to make the acts and ideas in study habitual. We find ourselves with each expression better able to perform such acts as the pronunciation of foreign words. I can't get interested in medieval history. This illustrates a kind of complaint frequently made by college students. It is our purpose in this chapter to show the fallacy of this. to prove that interest may be developed in an uninteresting subject and to show how. In order to lay a firm foundation for our psychologizing, let us examine into the nature of interest and see what it really is. It has been defined as the recognition of a thing which has been vitally connected with experience before, a thing recognized as old, impulse to attend. Interest naturally arouses tendencies to act. The root idea of the term seems to be that of being engaged, engrossed, or entirely taken up with some activity because of its recognized worth. Interest marks the annihilation of the distance between the person and the materials and results of his action. It is the sign of their organic union. In addition to the characteristics just mentioned, should be noted that the pleasurableness that usually attends any activity in which we are interested. A growing feeling of pleasure is the sign which notifies us that we are growing interested in a subject, and it is such an aid in the performance of work that we should seek earnestly to acquire it in connection with any work we have to do. The persons who make the complaint at the head of this chapter notice that they take interest easily in certain things, a Jack London story, a dish of ice cream, a football game. And they take interest in them so spontaneously and effortlessly that they think these interests must be born within them. When we examine carefully the interests of man and trace their sources, we see that the above view is fallacious. We acquire most of our interests in the course of our experience. Professor James asserts an adult man's interests are almost every one of them intensely artificial. They have been slowly built up. The objects of professional interest are most of them in their original nature, repulsive, but by their connection with such natively exciting objects as one's personal fortune, one's social responsibilities, and especially by the force of invertebrate habit, they grow to be the only things for which in middle life a man profoundly cares. Since interests are largely products of experience, then it follows that if we wish to have an interest in a given subject, we must consciously and purposefully develop it. There is wide choice open to us. We may develop interest in early Victorian literature, prize fight promoting, social theory, lignitic rocks, history of Siam, the collection of scarabs, medieval history. We should not be deceived by the glibness of the above statements into assuming that the development of interest is an easy matter. It requires adherence to certain definite psychological laws which may call the laws of interest. The first may be stated as follows. In order to develop interest in a subject, secure information about it. The force of this law will be apparent as soon as we analyze one of our already developed interests. Let us take one that is quite common. The interest which a typical young girl takes in a movie star. Her interest in him comes largely from what she has been able to learn about him, the names of the productions in which he has appeared, his age, the color of his automobile, his favorite novel. Her interest may be said actually to consist, at least in part, of these facts. The astute press agent knows the force of this law, and at well-timed intervals, he lets slip through bits of information about the star, which fan the interest of their fair devotee to a still whiter heat. The relation of information to interest is still further illustrated by the case of the typical university professor or scientist. He is interested in certain objects of research, infusoria, electrons, plant ecology, because he knows so much about them. His interest may be said to consist partly of the body of knowledge that he possesses. He was not always interested in the specific, obscure field, but by saturating himself in facts about it, he has developed an interest in it amounting to passionate absorption, which manifests itself in absent-mindedness of such profundity as to make him often an object of wonder and ridicule. Let us demonstrate the application of the law, again showing how interest may be developed in a specific college subject. Let us choose one that is generally regarded as so difficult and abstract that not many people are interested in it. Philology, the study of language as a science. Let us imagine that we are trying to interest a student of law in this. As a first step, we shall proceed from the known to the unknown. A classic example of good educational practice in this connection is the way in which Francis W. Parker, a progressive educator of a former generation, taught geography. When he desired to show how water running over hard, rocky soil produced a Niagara, he took his class down to the creek behind the schoolhouse, built a dam, and allowed the water to flow over it. When he wished to show how water flowing over soft ground resulted in a deltoid Nile, he took the class to a low, flat portion of the creek bed and pointed out the effect. The creek bed constituted an old familiar element in the children's experience. Niagara and the Nile described in terms of it were intelligible. Naturally, in modern educational practice, it is not always possible to have miniature waterfalls and river bottoms at hand. Still, it is possible to follow this principle. When in studying medieval history, you read a description of the guilds, do not regard them as distant, cold, inert institutions devoid of significance in your life. Rather, think of them in terms of things you already know: modern labor unions, technical schools, insofar as the comparison holds good. Then trace their industrial descendants down to the present time. By thus thinking about the guilds, hitherto distant and uninteresting, you will begin to see them suffused with meaning, allied with significance, a real part of yourself. In short, you will have achieved interest. There is still another psychological law of interest. In order to develop interest in a subject, exert activity towards it. We see the force of this law when we observe a man in the process of developing an interest in golf. At the start, he may have no interest in it whatever. He may even deride it. Yielding to the importunities of his friends, however, he takes his stick in hand and samples the game. Then he begins to relent, admits that perhaps there may be something interesting about the game after all. As he practices with greater frequency, he begins to develop a warmer and still warmer interest until finally he thinks of little else, neglecting social and professional obligations and boring his friends ad nauseum with recitals of golfing incidents. The methods by which the new-fledged golfer develops an interest in golf will apply with equal effectiveness in the case of a student. In trying to become interested in medieval history, keep actively engaged in it. Read book after book dealing with the subject. Apply it to your studies in political economy, English, and American history. Choose subtopics in medieval history as the subjects for themes in English composition courses. Try to help some other students in the class. Take part in class discussions and talk informally with the instructor outside of the classroom. Use your ingenuity to devise methods of keeping active toward the subject. Presently, you will discover that the subject no longer appears cold and forbidding, but that it glows warm with virility, that it has become interesting. It will readily be noticed that the two laws of interest here set forth are closely interrelated. One can hardly seek information about a subject without exerting activity towards it. Conversely, one cannot maintain activity on behalf of a subject without at the same time acquiring information about it. These two easily remembered and easily applied rules of study will go far towards solving some of the most trying conditions of student life. Memorize them, apply them, and you will find yourself in possession of a power which will stay with you long after you quit college walls, one which you may apply with profit in many different situations of life. We have shown in this chapter the fallacy of the assumption that a student cannot become genuinely interested in a subject which at first seems uninteresting. We have shown that he may develop interest in any subject if he but employs the proper psychological methods, that he must obey the twofold law, secure information about the subject, stating the new in terms of the old, and exert activity toward it. That when he has thus lighted the flame of interest, he will find his entire intellectual life illuminated, glowing with purpose, resplendent with success. In concluding this discussion, we should note the wide difference between the quality of study which is done with interest and that done without it. Under the latter condition, the student is a slave, a drudge; under the former, a god, a creator. Touched by the galvanic spark, he sees new significances in every page, in every line. As his vision enlarges, he perceives new relations between his study and his future aims. Indeed, between his study and the progress of the universe, and he goes between his study and the progress of the universe, and he goes to his educational tasks not as a prisoner weighted down by ball and chain, but as an eager prospector infatuated by the lust for gold. Encouraged by the continual stores of new things he uncovers, intoxicated by the ozone of mental activity, he delves continually deeper until finally he emerges rich with knowledge and full of power. The intellectual power that signifies mastery over a subject. Reading and exercises. Readings. James 8, chapter 10 and 11. DV 3. Exercise 1. Show how your interest in some subject, for example, the game of football, has grown in proportion to the number of facts you have discovered about it and the activity you have exerted toward it. Exercise 2. Choose some subject in which you are not at present interested. Make the statement, I am determined to develop an interest in. I will take the following specific steps towards this end. In our investigation of the psychology of study, we have so far directed our attention chiefly toward the subjective side of the question, seeking to discover the contents of mind during study. We shall now take an objective view of study, examining not the contents of mind nor methods of study, but the objective results of study. In doing this, we choose certain units of measurement, the number of minutes required for learning a given amount or the amount learned in a stated period of time. We may do this for the learning of any material, whether it words translated being represented by the vertical spaces on the chart. Thus, on the 10th day, 25 words were translated. On the 20th day, 45 words. Illustration graph, study of Russian. In making an analysis of this typical curve, we note immediately an exceeding irregularity. At one time, there is extraordinary improvement, but a later measurement registers pronounced loss. This irregularity is very common in learning. Some days we do a great amount of work and do it well, but perhaps the very next day shows marked diminution in our work. The second characteristic we note is that there is extremely rapid progress at the beginning, the curve slanting up quietly sharply. This is common in learning and may be accounted for in several ways. In the first place, the easiest things come first. For example, when you are beginning the study of German, you are given mostly monosyllabic words to learn. These are easily remembered. Hence, monosyllabic words to learn. These are easily remembered. Hence, progress is rapid. A second reason is that at the beginning there are many different respects in which progress can be made. For example, the beginner in German must learn nouns, case endings, declensions of adjectives, days of the week. In short, a vast number of new things all at once. At a later period, however, the number of new things to be learned is much smaller and improvement cannot be so rapid. A third reason why learning proceeds more rapidly at first is that the interest is greater at this time. You have doubtless many times experienced this fact, and you know that when a thing has the interest of novelty, you work harder upon it. If you will examine the learning curve closely, you will note that after the initial spurt, there is a slowing up. The curve at this point resembles a plateau and indicates cessation of process, if not retrogression. This period of no progress is regarded as a characteristic of the learning curve and is a time of great discouragement to the conscientious student, so distressing that we may designate it the plateau of despond. Most people describe it as a time when they feel unable to learn more about a subject. The mind seems to be sated. New ideas cannot be assimilated and old ones seems to be forgotten. The plateau may extend for a long or a short time, depending upon the nature of the subject matter and the length of time over which the learning extends. In the case of professional training, it may extend over a year or more. In the case of growing children in school, it sometimes happens that an entire year elapses during which the learning of an apparently bright student is retarded. In a course of study in high school or college, it may come on about the third week and extend a month or more. Something akin to the plateau may come in the course of a day. When we realize that our efficiency is greatly activity, we should analyze it and see what factors operate to influence it. It is interesting to note that the plateau generally occurs just before an abrupt rise in efficiency. This is significant, for it may mean that the plateau is necessary in learning, especially just before reaching the really advanced stages of proficiency. Accordingly, when you are experiencing a plateau in the mastery of some accomplishment, you may perhaps derive some comfort from the prospect of an approaching rise in efficiency. On the theory that is a necessary part of learning, it has been regarded as a resting place. We are so constituted by nature that we cannot run on indefinitely. Nature sometimes must call a halt. Consequently, the plateau may be a warning that we cannot learn more for the present and that the proper remedy is to refrain for a little while from further efforts in that line. We have possible justifications for this interpretation when we reflect that a vacation does us much good, and though we begin it while from further efforts in that line. We have possible justifications for this interpretation when we reflect that a vacation does us much good, and though we begin it feeling stale, we end it feeling much fresher and more efficient. But to stop work temporarily is not the only way to meet a plateau, and fatigue or ennui is probably not the sole or most compelling explanation. It may be that we should not regard the objective results as the true measure of learning. Perhaps learning is going on even though the results are not apparent. We discovered something in the nature of unconscious learning in our discussion of memory. And it may be that a period of little objective progress marks a period of active unconscious learning. Another meaning which the plateau may have is simply to mark places of greater difficulty. As already remarked, the early period is a stage of comparative ease, but as the work becomes more difficult, progress is slower. It is also quite likely that the plateau may indicate that some of the factors operative at the start are operative no longer. Thus, although the learning was rapid at the beginning because the material learned at that time was easy, the plateau may come because the things to be learned have become difficult. Or, whereas the beginning was attacked with considerable interest, the plateau may mean that the interest is dying down and that less effort is being exerted. If these theories are the true explanation of the plateau, we see that it is not to be regarded as a time of reduction in learning to be contemplated with despair. The appropriate attitude may be one of resignation with the determination to make it as slightly disturbing as possible. But though the reasons just described may have something to do with the production of the plateau, as yet we have no evidence that the plateau cannot be dispensed with. It is practically certain that the plateau is not caused entirely by necessity, frequently is due. We must regretfully admit to poor early preparation. If at the beginning of a period of learning an insecure foundation is laid, it cannot be expected to support the burden of more difficult subject matter. We have enumerated a number of the explanations that have been advanced to account for the plateau, and have seen that it may have several causes, among which are necessity for rest, increased difficulty of subject matter, loss of interest, and insufficient preparation. In trying to eliminate the plateau, our remedy should be adapted to the cause. In recognition of the fact that learning proceeds irregularly, we see that it is rational to expect the amount of effort to be exerted throughout a period of learning to vary. It will vary partly with the difficulty of subject matter and partly with fluctuations in bodily and mental efficiency, which are bound to occur from day to day. Since this irregularity is bound to occur, you may well make your effort vary from one extreme to the other. At times, perhaps your effort vary from one extreme to the other. At times, perhaps your most profitable move may be to take a complete vacation. The vacation might cover several weeks, a weekend, or if the plateau is merely a low period in the day's work, then 10 minutes may suffice for a vacation. As an adjunct to such rest periods, some form of recreation should usually be planned, for the essential thing is to permit the mind to rest from the tiresome activity. If your plateau represents greater difficulty of subject matter and loss of interest, your duty is plainly to work harder. In exerting more effort, make some changes in your methods of study. For example, if you have been accustomed to study a certain subject by silent reading, begin to read your lessons aloud. Change your method of taking notes or change the hour of day in which you prepare your lesson. In short, try any of the methods described in this book and use your own ingenuity, and the changes in method may overcome the plateau. If a plateau is due to our last mentioned cause, insufficient preparation, the remedy must be drastic. To make new resolutions and to put forth additional effort is not enough. You must go back and relay the foundation. Make a thorough review of the work which you covered slightingly, making sure that every step is clear. This process was described in an earlier chapter as the clarification of ideas and is absolutely essential in building up a structure of knowledge that will stand. Indeed, as you take various courses, you will find that your study will be much improved by periodical reviews. The benefits cannot all be enumerated here, but we may reasonably claim that a review will be very likely to remove a plateau, and used with the other remedies herein suggested will help you to rid yourself of one of the most discouraging features of student life. Reading Swift 20, Chapter 4. Exercise 1. Describe one or more plateaus that you have observed in your own experience. What do you regard as the causes? Did you ever engage in any exhausting physical work for a long period of time? If so, you probably remember that as you proceeded, you became more and more fatigued, finally reaching a point when it seemed that you could not endure the strain another minute. You had just decided to give up, when suddenly the fatigue seemed to diminish and new energy seemed to come from some source. This curious thing, which happens frequently in athletic activities, is known as second wind and is described by those who have experienced it as a time of increased power when the work is done with greater ease and effectiveness and with a freshness and vigor in great contrast to the staleness that preceded it. It is as though one tapped a level of new energy, revealing hidden stores of unexpected power. And it is commonly reported that with persistence in pushing oneself further and further, a third and fourth wind may be uncovered, each one leading to greater heights of achievements. This phenomenon occurs not alone only the physical plane. It is discernible in mental exertion as well. True, we seldom experience it because we are mentally lazy and have the habit of stopping our work at the first signs of fatigue. Did we persist, however, disregarding fatigue and ennui, we should find ourselves tapping vast reserves of mental power and accomplishing mental feats of astonishing brilliancy. The occasional occurrence of the phenomenon of second wind gives ground for the statement that we possess more energy than we ordinarily use. There are several lines of evidence for this statement. One is to be found in the energizing effects of emotional excitement. Under the impetus of anger, a man shows far greater strength than he ordinarily uses. Similarly, a mother manifests the strength of a tigress when her young is endangered. A second line of evidence is furnished by the effect of stimulants. Alcohol brings to the fore surprising reserves of physical and psychic energy. Lastly, we have innumerable instances of accession of strength under the stimulus of an idea. Under the domination of an all-absorbing idea, one performs feats of extraordinary strength, utilizing stores of energy otherwise out of reach. We have only to read of the heroic achievements of little Joan of Arc for an example of such manifestation of reserve power. When we examine this accession of energy, we find it to be describable in several ways: physiologically, neurologically, and psychologically. The physiological effects consist in a heightening of the bodily functions in general. The muscles become more ready to act. The circulation is accelerated. The breathing more rapid. Curious things take place in various glands throughout the body. One, the adrenal gland, has been the object of special study and has been shown, upon the arousal of these reserves of energy, to produce a secretion of the utmost importance in providing for sudden emergencies. This little gland is located above the kidney and is aroused to intense activity at times, pouring out into the blood a fluid that goes all over the body. Some of its effects are to furnish the blood with chemicals that act as fuel to the muscles, assisting them to contract more vigorously, to make the lungs more active in introducing oxygen into the system, to make the heart more active in distributing the blood throughout the body. Such glandular activity is an important physiological condition of these higher levels of energy. In neurological terms, the increase in energy consists in the flow of more nervous energy into the brain, particularly into those areas where it is needed for certain kinds of controlled thought and action. An abundance of nervous energy is very advantageous, for, as has been intimated in a former chapter, nervous energy is diffused and spread over all the pathways that are easily permeable to its distribution. This results in the use of considerable areas of brain surface and knits up many associations so that one idea calls up many other ideas. This leads us to recognize the psychological conditions of increased energy, which are first, the presence of more ideas, second, the more facile flow of ideas, the whole accompanied by a state of marked pleasurableness. Pleasure is a notable effect of increased energy. When work progresses rapidly and satisfactorily, it is accomplished with great zest and a feeling almost akin to exaltation. These conditions describe to some degree the conditions when we are doing efficient work. Since we are endowed with the energy requisite for such efficient work, the obvious question is, let us now examine the bodily conditions to see what fatigue is objectively. Physiologically, it has been demonstrated that fatigue is accompanied by three sorts of changes. First, poisons accumulate in the blood and affect the action of the nervous system, as has been shown by direct analysis. Mosso selected two dogs as nearly alike as possible. One he kept tied all day. The other he exercised until by night it was thoroughly tired. Then he transfused the blood of the tired animal into the veins of the rested one and produced in him all the signs of fatigue that were shown by the other. There can be no doubt that the waste products of the body accumulate in the blood and interfere with the action of the nerve cells and muscles. It is probable that these accumulations come as a result of mental as well as of physical work. A second change in fatigue has been found in the cell body of the neuron. Hodge showed that the size of the nucleus of the cell in the spinal cord of a bee diminished nearly 75% as a result of the day's activity, and that the nucleus became much less solid. A third change that has been demonstrated as a result of muscular work is the accumulation of waste product in the muscle tissue. Fatigued muscles contain considerable percentages of these products. That they are important factors in the fatigue process has been shown by washing them from a fatigued muscle. As a result, the muscle gains new capacity for work. The experiments are performed on the muscles of a frog that have been cut from the body and fatigued by electrical stimulation. When they will no longer respond, their sensitivity may be renewed by washing them in dilute alcohol or in a weak salt solution that will dissolve the products of fatigue. It is probable that these products stimulate the sense organs in the muscles and thus give some of the sensations of fatigue. Of these physical effects of fatigue, the accumulation of waste products in the blood and the effects upon the nerve cells are probably common both to mental and physical fatigue. The effect upon the muscles plays a part in mental fatigue only so far as all mental work involves some muscular activity. By this time, you must be convinced that the subject of fatigue is exceedingly complicated, that its effects are manifested differently in mind and body. In relieving fatigue, the first step to be taken is to rest properly. Man cannot work incessantly. He must rest sometimes. And it is just as important to know how to rest efficiently as to know how to work efficiently. By this is not meant that one should rest as soon as fatigue begins to be felt. Quite the reverse. Keep on working all the harder if you wish the second wind to appear. Perhaps 2 hours will exhaust your first supply of energy and will leave you greatly fatigued. Do not give up at this time. However, push yourself further in order to uncover the second layer of energy. Before entering upon this, however, it will be possible to secure some advantage by resting for about 15 minutes. Do not rest longer than this, or you may lose the momentum already secured and your 2 hours will have gone for naught. If one indulges in too long a rest, the energy seems to run down and more effort is required to work it up again than was originally expended. It is also important to observe the proper mental conditions during rest. Do not spend the 15 minutes in getting interested in some other object, for that will leave distracting ideas in the mind which will persist when you resume work. Make the rest a time of physical and mental relief. Move cramped muscles, rest your eyes and let your thoughts idly wander. Then come back to work in 10 or 15 minutes and you will be amazed at the refreshed feeling with which you do your work and at the accession of new energy that will come to you. Keep on at this new plane and your work will take on all the attributes of the second wind level of efficiency. Besides planning intelligent rests, you may also adjust yourself to fatigue by arranging your daily program so as to do your hardest work when you are fresh and your easiest when your efficiency is low. In other words, you are a human dynamo and should adjust yourself to the different loads you carry. When carrying a heavy load, employ your best energies. But when carrying only a light load, exert a proportionate amount of energy. Every student has tasks of routine nature which do not require a high degree of energy, such as copying material. Plan to perform such work when your stock of energy is lowest. One of the best ways to ensure the attainment of a higher plane of mental efficiency is to assume one of the most vexatious periods of student life is examination time. This is almost universally a time of great distress, giving rise in extreme cases to conditions of nervous collapse. The reason for this is not far to seek, for upon the results of examinations frequently depend momentous consequences, such as valuable appointments, diplomas, degrees, and other important events in the life of a student. In view of the importance of examinations, then, it is natural that they be regarded with considerable fear and trepidation. And it is important that we devise what rules we can for meeting their exactious demands with greatest ease and effectiveness. Examinations serve several purposes, the foremost of which is to inform the examiner regarding the amount of knowledge possessed by the student. In discovering this, two methods may be employed. First, to test whether or not the student knows certain things, plainly a reproductive exercise. Second, to see how well the student can apply his knowledge. But this is not the only function of an examination. It also shows the student how much he knows or does not know. Again, the examination often serves as an incentive to harder work on the part of the student, for if one knows there will be an examination in a subject, one usually study with greater zeal than when an examination is not expected. Lastly, an examination may help the student to link up facts in new ways and to see them in new relationships. In this aspect, you readily see that examinations constitute a valuable device in learning. But students are not very patient in philosophizing about the purpose of examinations, declaring that if examinations are a necessary part of the educational process, they wish some advice that will enable them to pass examinations easily and with credit to themselves. So, we shall turn our attention to the practical problems of passing examinations. Our first duty in giving advice is to call attention to the necessity for faithful work throughout the course of study. Some students seem to think that they can slight their work throughout a course and by vigorous cramming at the end make up for slighted work and pass the examination. This is an extremely dangerous attitude to take. It might work with certain kinds of subject matter, a certain type of student mind, and a certain kind of examiner. But as a general practice, it is a most treacherous method of passing a course. The greatest objection from a psychological standpoint is that we have reason to believe that learning thus concentrated is not so permanently effective as that extended over a long period of time. For instance, a German course extending over a year has much to commend it over a course with the same number of recitation hours crowded into 2 months. We already discussed the reason for this in chapter 6, when we showed the beneficial results coming from the distribution of impressions over a period of time. Against cramming, it may further be urged that the hasty impression of a mass of new material is not likely to be lasting. Particularly is this true when the cramming is made specifically for a certain examination. As we saw in the chapter on memory, the intention to remember affects the firmness of retention, and if the cramming is done merely with reference to the examination, the facts learned may be forgotten and never be available for future use. So, we may lay it down as a rule that feverish exertions at the end of a course cannot replace conscientious work throughout the course. In spite of these objections, however, we must admit that cramming has some value if it does not take the form of new acquisition of facts but consists more of a manipulation of facts already learned. As a method of review, it has an eminently proper place and may well be regarded as indispensable. Some students, it is true, assert that they derive little benefit from a pre-examination review, but one is inclined to question their methods. We have already found that learning is characteristically aided by reviews and that recall is facilitated by recency of impression. Reviewing just before examination serves the memory by providing repetition and recency, which, as we learned in the chapter on memory, are conditions for favorable impression. A further value of cramming is that by means of such a summarizing review, one is able to see facts in a greater number of relations than before. It too often happens that when facts are taken up in a course, they come in a more or less detached form. But at the conclusion of the course, a review will show the facts in perspective and will disclose many new relations between them. Another advantage of cramming is that at such a time, one usually works at a high plane of efficiency. The task of reviewing in a few hours the work of an entire course is so huge that the attention is closely concentrated, impressions are made vividly, and the entire mentality is tuned up so that facts are well impressed, coordinated, and retained. These advantages are not at all present in the more leisurely learning of a course. So, we see that cramming may be regarded as a useful device in learning. We must not forget that many of the advantages secured by cramming are dependent upon the methods pursued. These are good methods and poor methods of cramming. One of the most reprehensible of the latter is to get into a flurry and scramble madly through a mass of facts without regard to their relation to each other. This method is characterized by breathless haste and an anxious fear lest something be missed or forgotten. Perhaps its most serious evil is its formlessness and lack of plan. In other words, the facts should not be seized upon singly but should be regarded in the light of their different relations with each other. Suppose, for example, you are reviewing for an examination in medieval history. The important events may be studied according to countries, studying one country at a time, but that is not sufficient. The events occurring during one period in one country should be correlated with those occurring in another country at the same time. Likewise, the movements in the field of science and discovery should be correlated with movements in the fields of literature, religion, and political control. Tabulate the events in chronological order and compare the different series of events with each other. In this way, the facts will be seen in new relations and will be more firmly impressed so that you can use them in answering a great variety of questions. Having made preparation of the subject matter of the examination, the next step is to prepare yourself physically for the trying ordeal, for it is well known that the mind acts more ably under physically healthful conditions. Go to the examination room with your body rested after a good night's sleep. Eat sparingly before the examination, for mental processes are likely to be clogged if too heavy food is taken. Having reached the examination room, there are a number of considerations that are requisite for success. Some of the advice here given may seem to be superfluous, but if you had ever corrected examination papers, you would see the need of it all. Let your first step consist of a preliminary survey of the examination questions. Read them all over slowly and thoughtfully in order to discover the extent of the task set before you. A striking thing is accomplished by this preliminary reading of the question. Accomplished by this preliminary reading of the questions. It seems as though during the examination period, the knowledge relating to the different questions assembles itself, and while you are focusing your attention upon the answer to one question, the answers to the other questions are formulating themselves in your mind. It is a semi-conscious operation, akin to the unconscious learning discussed in the chapter on memory. In order to take advantage of it, it is necessary to have the questions in mind as soon as possible. Then it will be found that relevant associations will form and will come to the surface when you reach the particular questions. During the examination, when some of these associations come into consciousness ahead of time, it is often wise to digress from the question in hand long enough to jot them down. By all means, preserve them. For if you do not write them down, they may leave you and be lost. Sometimes very brilliant ideas come in flashes, and inasmuch as they are so fleeting, it is wise to grasp them and fix them while they are fresh. In writing the examination, be sure you read every question carefully. Each question has a definite point. Look for it and do not start answering until you are sure you have found it. Discover the implications of each question. Canvass its possible interpretations, and if it is at all ambiguous, seek light from the instructor if he is willing to make any further comment. It is well to have scratch paper handy and make outlines for your answers to long questions. It is a good plan also when dealing with long questions to watch the time carefully, for there is danger that you will spend too much time upon some question to the detriment of others equally important, though shorter. One error which students often commit